Chapter 176: Italian Advances in Libya. In many ways, German and Italian history were parallel. Both came from ancient cultures dating back to classical antiquity, and both cultures had lived as the respective hegemon of their own regions for a period of time. Italy, for example, had ruled as the supreme hegemon of the Mediterranean during the latter centuries of classical antiquity, while in Germany's case, the erroneously named Holy Roman Empire had served as, more or less, the supreme sovereign of Europe during the High Middle Ages. But in this world, time alone remained undefeated. Whether you were a dynasty of kings, an unrivaled empire, or a god himself, sooner or later, all things came to an end. It was simply a matter of time. Every civilization that had ever existed sooner or later disappeared into the annals of history. And if given enough time, every culture and language that had ever appeared on Earth would do the same. Such rules were universal in life. At the end of the day, even this universe we live in will come to an end. It was for that reason that the ancient Roman and Holy Roman empires were nothing more than ruins left behind, and the whispers of ghosts, whose historical records had miraculously survived until this very time. Interestingly enough, Germany and Italy also shared a similarity in this regard as well, for when their ancient and great empires had collapsed, they essentially splintered into a fractured culture of various petty kingdoms, principalities, and republics, all of which had fought with themselves and their neighbors until finally uniting once more into a single nation in the latter half of the 19th century. Perhaps it was merely coincidence, but curiously enough, both the German Reich and the Kingdom of Italy united in the same exact year, 1871 to be precise. While the process had begun decades earlier for both nations, it was not until 1871 that both nations unified beneath a single banner and monarch. However, unlike the German Reich, Italy was not a nation known for its military prowess. While the Germans had a proud military history dating back to the days when they contended with Rome for control of their own borders, Italy had more or less either been occupied by foreign powers or had been seen as a joke in this regard since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. While still considered a great power by the world, Italy was also known as the least of the great powers, and accurately so. In Bruno's past life, they had fought 12 battles in Isonzo with the Austro-Hungarians to determine who was the worst of the great powers, and in doing so, lost at Caporetto. Had the war continued for another year or two, Italy would have capitulated as their lines were thoroughly broken through by the combined forces of the German Reich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the 12th and last Battle of Isonzo, also more commonly referred to as the Battle of Caporetto. Though the Italians had halted the advance of the Central Powers at the Piave River and gained much-needed reinforcements from their allies in Great Britain and France, it was only a matter of time before Venice was taken, as the Prime Minister's government had already thoroughly collapsed as a result of the battle. But that was another timeline, one where Bruno had long since resolved to ensure never happened in his new lease on life. Rather, the year was currently 1911, and such battles had yet to be waged. Instead, Italy was entrenched in war within Libya. Currently, a relatively young Italian colonel by the name of Giovanni Colombo was standing within a trench, looking over the edge of it through a pair of binoculars with a cigarette in his mouth. Unlike Bruno, who was clean-shaven, this man had a thick and stout dark brown mustache, which paired with his olive skin quite well. However, the mustache, like the rest of his appearance, was rather unkempt. In fact, there were wrinkles on the man's face that made him appear much older than he actually was, along with plenty of mud, blood, and oil stains across his uniform and flesh. The fighting in Libya, as Bruno had predicted, had been halted outside Shar al-Shad, resulting in the Italians taking out their fury on the local population, massacring some few hundred civilians before digging into trenches and waiting for reinforcements to arrive. This was despite the first use of airplanes in warfare for the purposes of both reconnaissance and aerial bombardment, which came in the form of dropping a few grenades from the sky on enemy positions. Even the deployment of the Fiat Arsenal, an Italian-made armored car, had utterly failed to break through the Ottoman lines despite significant advancements made during the initial landing in North Africa. As a result, the fighting had turned into static trench warfare, while the Italians waited on reinforcements from the fatherland to arrive in the region to relieve them. The fighting was made all the more brutal by the early adoption of machine guns as a result of Bruno's interference with the timeline. Both the Ottomans and Italians made use of Maxim-style machine guns, as both nations were still developing their own domestic designs and had yet to field anything other than a prototype at the moment. Because of this, the death toll had increased significantly in the conflict over what it had been during Bruno's past life. As a colonel in the Royal Italian Army, Giovanni was in command of a brigade's worth of men who were currently waiting in the dead of night, as flares shot overhead lighting up the dark sky. They were told to hold this position until they were properly relieved, but at the same time, the Ottomans were doing the same. Neither side dared to advance out of fear of the sheer carnage that would occur. And because of this, Giovanni, like his men, was forced to rest in the mud and watch the enemy as they, too, watched him. He could only sigh and shake his head while silently praying to God above that this brutal war would come to an end sooner rather than later. It was at this moment that a soldier in a similar uniform ran up to the colonel. He appeared out of breath, as if he had run quite the distance, as he quickly announced why he was so flustered, all the while handing over the paper in his hand that conveyed orders from high command. "Sir, General Caneva has given his orders. The message we received reads as follows. It is absolutely necessary that you do not advance upon the enemy position until reinforcements arrive. Hold your ground." It took everything Giovanni had not to curse under his breath. Why waste the resources necessary to send such a message across the Mediterranean when there were more important matters to take care of? Frankly speaking, it was emblematic of General Caneva's personality to do such a thing. He was a man regarded by his own troops as being too conventional, too passive, and quite honestly, too cowardly. In a war where cavalry was remarkably well suited, he had failed to deploy them, and despite his numerical inferiority, the general had also not requested reinforcements until suffering his first major defeat. Additionally, the man had completely failed to consult with the local Arab leaders, who were also pissed off at their Ottoman rulers and would gladly take the opportunity to raise some hell on behalf of the Italians. The fact that the Italians had steamrolled through the Ottomans during this same conflict within Bruno's past life was more of a testament to Ottoman incompetency than it was to Italian military prowess. And General Caneva was just one of many Italian generals who was remarkably inept despite his high position. Though, luckily for the Italians, their major rival in Europe shared the same degree of problems, with the Austro-Hungarians having perhaps one competent general, whom Bruno had long since established friendly ties to. Because of this, Colonel Colombo sighed heavily, taking a drag from what little remained of his cigarette. He finally spoke after he had exhaled everything from his lungs, with a tone that sounded as if it were suppressing anger on a deeply spiritual level. "All right, dismissed." Once the runner had scurried off, Colonel Colombo shook his head and looked over at his immediate subordinate before giving an order that was directly counter to the ones he had received from the general. "It would appear we are having issues with these new wireless telegrams. I'm afraid the message we received from the general was rather jumbled. He did say that it was absolutely necessary to advance upon the enemy position before reinforcements arrived. Is that correct?" Having grown sick and tired of sitting around waiting for others to arrive, when the enemy was currently sleeping in their trenches completely unaware that the Italians were planning an advance, the major who served directly beneath the colonel wore a toothy grin as he confirmed that those were indeed the words they had received from high command. "That's what I heard." Seeing how the officers beneath his command were of the same opinion, Giovanni smirked. Before giving an order, "Silently go awake the men. I want our advance to catch those Turkish bastards by surprise. The last thing they will see as they awake from their slumber is the sight of Italian soldiers right before we slit their throats." With this, a rather unexpected night raid was about to begin, one that would hasten the Italian victory in Libya, and one that would also cause Bruno great concern when he read about it in the paper later that week. Chapter 177, Time Traveler or Prophet. Bruno was surprised when he received his morning paper along with his cup of coffee from his young maid, who personally ensured that he had these things every morning. The announcement that the Ottoman lines had been thoroughly broken through as a result of a daring night raid conducted under the orders of an Italian officer he was unfamiliar with, was indeed not the greatest news to receive in the morning. To anyone else, this would be innocuous at worst and exciting at best, as it meant the war would be coming to a close sooner than expected. With that in mind, there would be less suffering in the world if one were so inclined to care about the lives of strangers. A rarity among the human species, to be sure, and frankly speaking, Bruno doubted such people actually existed. But to him, this news was more than troublesome. The Italians were supposed to wait until reinforcements had arrived. 100,000 men were shipping off to Libya from the Italian fatherland for this very purpose. And yet, the remainder of Italy's initial push into North Africa had succeeded where it had not in his past life. This had moved up the timetables of the Italo-Turkish War by several months, at the very least. Sure, in the past, things had been moved up in the timeline, largely as a result of Bruno's own interference. For example, both the Boxer Rebellion and the Russo-Japanese War had ended earlier than they should have. As for the Russian Civil War, it began in 1904 as a result of what should have normally been a swift and rather bloodless, at least by comparison, Russian Revolution of 1905. But because of how thoroughly Bruno had crushed the Russian army on behalf of his Japanese allies at Port Arthur and Mukden, the revolution not only began earlier, but also morphed into a full-fledged civil war much earlier than it should have. These events had rather drastic impacts on world affairs, but had more or less remained consistent with Bruno's past life as far as the integrity of the timeline was concerned. However, the butterfly effect was now revealing itself in far less subtle ways. If the Italo-Turkish War ended in 1911 rather than 1912, it would mean that the Balkan Wars would begin that much earlier. And should they end at the same rate as before or, God forbid, even quicker, as most conflicts in this timeline had resolved themselves with such expediency, then the Great War would not begin in 1914 as it had in his past life. Was Germany prepared to wage war against their enemies? Most certainly so. They could easily hold the line with their current preparations until sufficient numbers of U-boats, destroyers, panzers, armored cars, and biplanes were produced in significant enough numbers to push into Paris. But was this the most ideal outcome he had spent the last 10 years preparing for? Most certainly not. If the war began 1 or 2 years earlier, it would not be catastrophic, but German losses would be far more severe, let alone Russian and Austro-Hungarian losses, both of which were far behind Germany in terms of the necessary preparations for the upcoming global conflict. As a result, Bruno gazed sternly at the paper, prompting a response from his maid, who was concerned by the expression he made as he read the news. "Is something the matter, Mr. von Zehntner?" Bruno looked over at his maid and shifted his expression, masking his concern with a carefree fa as he assured her everything was fine. "Not in the slightest. I just have the misfortune of losing a slight sum of money on a wager. It is nothing you need to concern yourself with, my dear Frida." Bruno had always been especially polite to his employees, and for those who worked in his home, they were almost akin to family. He knew them each by name and was also all too aware of their family situations. Frida had, over the years, grown to respect Bruno very much. While she initially developed some form of romantic inclination toward the man, as the years passed, and she continued to serve as his maid, she had long since lost such interests, knowing that the man was already thoroughly infatuated with his wife. Nor did she care to pursue her flights of fancy, as she respected Heidi too much to ever attempt such a foolish pursuit. Still, she always enjoyed how kind Bruno was and took this as an opportunity to lecture him on the sinful vice of gambling. "While I hope you didn't lose too much, you should be aware that gambling is bad for the soul, and I would urge you to stop while you're still ahead." Heidi walked in about this time, while Bruno thanked the young woman for her moral lecture. Seeing this as a good time to help her husband escape such a thing, she was quick to point out to the young maid that she still had work to tend to. "Frida, while I do appreciate your concern for my husband and our family as a whole, need I remind you that the laundry is still yet to be tended to?" Upon realizing that she was shirking her duties while blathering on about morals for no particular reason, the young maid blushed and bowed her head in embarrassment, apologizing to her master's wife and assuring her that the work would be done swiftly. "Apologies, madam. I will go tend to it right this instant." With that said, the young woman scurried off like a frightened rabbit, while Bruno chuckled at her chipper attitude. Heidi was quick to ask the man what had really gotten him in such a sour mood to begin with, as she was all too aware of what was happening around the world and Bruno's role in it. How bad is it? Bruno scratched his chin, now having some peace and quiet to silently think through the implications of this recent development, before looking over with as fearsome a gaze as when the first read the article in the paper. The timeline has been moved up. If things continue like this, we are looking at the outbreak of war by the start of 1914, if not even earlier. I did not expect the Italians to be so bold. General Caneva is not a man known for action, rather just the opposite. Such a passive and cowardly man would not dare take such a risk until he had the overwhelming numbers to support his advance. Nor would I expect the Italians, of all people, to behave so courageously. They are, after all, not exactly a nation known for their martial prowess, or at least they haven't been since we toppled their empire in 476. Though the news was grim, far more so than Heidi expected it to be, she forced a smug smirk on her pretty face as she made a comment in response to Bruno's final words, mocking him for how he chose to phrase it. I must say, I didn't know you were personally involved in the downfall of Rome. Tell me, how exactly did you manage this, and yet still look so young here, and now nearly a millennium and a half later? Bruno chuckled when he heard this quip from his wife. She knew just how to cheer him up when he was in a grim mood. He couldn't help but make a comment in response, one that was somewhat true to an extent, all while raising his hands in a feigned admission of guilt. You got me, Heidi. I'm secretly a time traveler. Heidi laughed when she heard this, shaking her head at the absurdity of it. Contrary to what Bruno expected, she half believed he was serious, or she would have if she hadn't known the man since they were both small children. It was no exaggeration to say the married couple had known each other for almost the entirety of their lives. Although, this was the only reason she knew such a thing couldn't be true. Nevertheless, Bruno had an almost uncanny ability to predict the future and had even acted on this perceived foresight to intervene on numerous occasions throughout the past few decades in order to gain favorable results for Germany. Then there was the odd fact that he seemed to have some degree of knowledge about technology that seemed far too advanced to reasonably be invented in the current year. Sure, he did not know how they fully functioned and spent years of time and investment in talented scientists and engineers to figure it out. But that did not mean that he himself was not responsible for the initial concept or the rough drafts that acted as proof that they could reasonably exist. On top of all of this, he had an almost divine sense when it came to sniffing out fortune. His luck was too good when it came to economies, gaining a substantial degree of control over land, resources, and capital as he built a vast fortune off wise investments that always seemed to pay off in both the short term and the long term. Because of all these things, Heidi had on more than one occasion suspected Bruno was either a literal prophet or someone who had come from the future. But the second of these suspicions was naturally not possible, as she had known him all of her life. Thus, she responded to this claim with a light-hearted retort. Had I met you as an adult, I would be certain you were, in fact, a time traveler, as you put it. But you and I have known each other since we were small children. And because of our shared past, I know such a thing can't be true. But I'm on to you, and sooner or later, I will find out your secret. It's only a matter of time before you slip up. After saying this, Heidi walked off. Talking to Bruno any further at the moment would disrupt his contemplation. She knew that if what he said was true, then he would need a long, silent moment to think through how to deal with this matter that was entirely out of his control. Chapter 178, Meddling in Foreign Elections. While the Italians and Ottomans were fighting to determine the ownership of Libya, major events were beginning to stir across the Atlantic. In the United States of America, the press was in full force, shifting public perception in favor of their chosen candidate. That's right, it was that time again. Every 4 years, the USA elected a presidential candidate into office. Normally, Bruno would not be interested in such a dull and dreadful matter, at least not from the perspective of his past life. But the election in the United States, which would be concluded in November 1912, was a matter of global security. Depending on who won, the USA would either do everything it could to stir the public toward guaranteed entry into the Great War, or it would do everything possible to stay out of it. Isolationism versus globalism, that was what the current U.S. election meant. and Bruno would do everything in his power to prevent Woodrow Wilson's rise to the presidency. There were few men in modern history, even among those who waved the banner of Marxism, that Bruno detested more than the 28th President of the United States. After all, Woodrow Wilson did everything he could to ensure Germany's destruction in 1918 and in the years that followed. He was the sole world leader who utterly refused any peace in Europe unless the Kaiser abdicated. In doing so, Wilson effectively forced the Weimar Republic into existence, which, by extension, led to the rise of the Nazi Party, a result of the Republic's monumental and catastrophic failures as a nation-state. Since Woodrow Wilson was at least partially responsible for the woes of the German people and their fall from grace, Bruno had a certain level of disdain for him. Preferably, peaceful means could be used to prevent his rise to power. And while peace was preferable, violence was always an effective solution for any problem. Resorting to it when all other options were exhausted was something Bruno had no qualms about. However, Bruno doubted he would need to take such underhanded and covert actions like assassination. He held significant control over American society, mostly in subtle ways that few truly understood. The media was a powerful tool for swaying the masses, who were often too ignorant to come to a conclusion on their own. One simple headline was all they needed, no matter how outlandish and beyond the boundaries of truth it was to fully form an opinion on something. Once an opinion or bias was formed, even if it was based on mistruths, it was hard to convince someone otherwise, especially if they were an idiot, which, from Bruno's perspective, most people were. Hence why he believed democracies and republics were inherently doomed to failure. And because of this, he had spent the last decade using various means to invest in the American media, especially the newspapers, which were the primary source of a citizen's news at this point in time. He had done so through inconspicuous means, using various figureheads, offshore accounts, and backdoor deals to hide the fact that he was the real figure in the shadows controlling these puppets. This made it damn difficult, especially with the current technological limitations, to trace him to any of the newspapers that printed articles questioning the moral character, intellectual capability, and physical stamina required to become the leader of the United States of America. Perhaps in Bruno's past life, there was only one presidential candidate who had ever been so ostracized by the media as Wilson was currently being. Many of the words printed that were outright libelous. But lawsuits could be settled with money and took many years to resolve. Judges could be bought, and cases could be thrown out with the passing of cash beneath the table. If there was one thing Bruno was not lacking in this world, it was wealth. And with his exceptional amount of wealth, there were only a few individuals who could challenge him in a game of manipulating the masses. Unfortunately, these individuals were busy vying with Bruno for control of international markets and had yet to understand how easy it was to corrupt a democratic government. On the contrary, this was not the first election Bruno had interfered with in sovereign and democratic nations. In fact, he had learned a valuable lesson from his past life. Though it was a tactic wielded by his enemies, it was an efficient one nonetheless, and Bruno was not the type to believe himself morally above underhanded means if they were practical. The truth of the matter was that the best way to undermine democracies was to buy out politicians, judges, sheriffs, and other elected officials at the local and state levels. They were much cheaper to bribe into your service than those at the national level. It was with this in mind that Bruno had spent the past decade using his wealth and ties to many American corporate interests to foster a bipartisan coalition of politicians at every level of the United States. This coalition was fiercely isolationist and used depictions of atrocities committed abroad, along with the horrors of war German volunteers faced in Russia, as examples of why America should stay out of global wars that did not concern them. Based on the committee of the same name from Bruno's past life, which was initially formed in 1940 for a similar purpose, the America First Committee had significant gains in local and state elections. In addition, they had a large presence in the U.S. Congress and Senate. Currently, William Howard Taft was the Republican nominee. Out of the four presidential candidates in the 1912 election, those being Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, and Eugene V. Debs, who ran for the socialist, Taft was the only one supporting diplomacy through trade rather than warfare. In the election of Bruno's previous life, Taft had performed poorly, gaining only 2 states in the Electoral College. But now, he was the favorite. Bruno had spent the better part of a decade shaping American public opinion to reinforce the Monroe Doctrine and keep the nation out of global affairs. It was, after all, the wish of the Founding Fathers to do exactly that. And because of this, the propaganda Bruno had invested untold fortunes to mass-produce expressed similar patriotic sentiments. Hence why Teddy Roosevelt and his neo-imperialistic policies were not favored by the public, nor were Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy ideas, which Bruno had unearthed and brought to the public's attention. Wilson's ideas supported armed intervention in foreign nations to spread American ideals of democracy and liberty, as if it were a right given to them by God. To the more religiously minded, such justifications were nothing more than heretical, and immediately lost Wilson any support from among them. Currently, Woodrow Wilson was sitting in his office, looking at the latest poll figures, which saw William Howard Taft with the largest share of the vote among the 4 candidates, as the only one with above 33% of the voter base expressing some degree of support for him. This baffled Wilson, who had been assured by his many backers that he was the guaranteed favorite for the election. This would have been the case if Bruno had not invested so heavily in his downfall, as Wilson had won the 1912 election via a landslide victory in Bruno's past life. Hence, he and his campaign manager were currently scratching their heads in disbelief, as he cursed out the public for believing so many lies spread about him in the papers. Are we seriously going to sit here and believe that such libel and slander have affected my campaign so thoroughly? Do the people really believe that I want to open the borders for Africans and Latin Americans to come freely into America and intermarry with the good, honest white folk of our beloved country? It's best to note that Woodrow Wilson was a notorious racist, but such a thing was not uncommon in the era. Because of this, Bruno had decided to mock him in a way that he found to be rather ironic. Much of the propaganda purported lies about Wilson being a cuckold with a particular fondness and support for interracial relationships. It went so far as to claim that if elected, he would legalize such practices nationwide. Such slander was obviously unfounded, as Wilson would do the exact opposite if elected, going so far as to make even attempting such a thing a felony in the District of Columbia. But even if these words were completely false, all the average American needed to see was a headline claiming such a thing from a reputable newspaper, and they would immediately vote against him. The Wilson campaign fought to sue these newspapers and radio shows, but due to Bruno's influence in the American courts, the cases were either stalled or thrown out entirely for lack of evidence. Either way, his campaign manager was completely defeated after looking at the current numbers, seeing how Wilson was almost guaranteed defeat at this rate. He made a suggestion that caused the would-be president to throw a bottle at him in response. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't believe we have the time or money to refute these allegations. Most of your donors have already withdrawn their support in light of these fallacious accusations. I think it would be best if we just threw in the towel at this point." Woodrow Wilson, as described, did not respond kindly to this remark, flying into a violent rage as he chased his campaign manager out of his office. If Bruno had witnessed this event, he would have broken out in laughter at the man's current suffering. Chapter 179, Echoes of the Forthcoming War, Part 1. Whether it was the war in Libya or the upcoming American election, Bruno had kept a close watch on world affairs. War was coming, and much quicker than he had previously thought it would. And it was perhaps because of this that he was now in close communication with Allied generals who he could trust had a level of competency. Russia was not particularly well known for its brilliant military commanders. Even Marshal Zhukov, who was praised for the victory over the Wehrmacht in the Second World War of Bruno's past life, had about as much subtlety and nuance as a blacksmith's hammer. But in the Great War, there was one general who stood above the rest among the Stavka, which was the name for the Russian Empire's military high command. General Mikhail Alexeyev was also a man Bruno had some friendly ties to. Having served beneath his command during the Russian Civil War, which in this life had occurred much earlier than in the previous timeline, Bruno often found himself one-upping the man in a game of chess when they were not on the battlefield. Mikhail also had a great degree of respect for Bruno, so much so that he had described Bruno as being a rare quality among military officers, insofar as he was one of the few generals in human history who preferred standing on the front lines of war with the soldiers beneath his authority rather than safely commanding his troops from afar. Because of this, he was one of Bruno's confidants, especially after the formal alliance known in this timeline as the Union of Imperial Powers was forged through Bruno's hard-fought and painstakingly manipulated efforts on the global stage. Currently, Mikhail was sitting in Bruno's home, along with another familiar face, a man who Bruno considered to be the only intelligent and competent general that Austro-Hungary could muster in its defense. Svetozar Barivi was a Croatian general in the Austro-Hungarian armed forces and was one of the finest defensive military leaders of the war. He was also invited to Bruno's home, and the two men had kept in touch ever since Bruno's first foray into the lands of the Habsburg dynasty. While Bruno had foresight given to him by experience from a life set 100 years from now, he did not make the mistake of believing his knowledge was both infallible and without peer. Instead, he very much liked to hear the opinions of history's greatest tactical minds, of which he did not consider himself among the prestigious ranks. Instead, Bruno sat with a cigarette in one hand and a stein of beer in the other as he and the two generals spoke together at his personal table. They had come a long way at his request, and if Bruno were to personally extend an invitation to anybody, it meant something big was happening. He was, after all, not the sociable type, preferring to live secluded among his own loved ones rather than putting on lavish social gatherings for what he considered to be a social class primarily filled with parasites leeching off the accomplishments of their greater forebears. Thus, when they saw his family's seal on the letter, the two men were quick to make the time to visit Berlin and speak with a man who seemed destined to change the world as they knew it. That is, assuming he had not already done so. One would not guess by the civilian attire that these men wore, but they were three of the greatest strategic minds within the imperial powers, and when Bruno spoke, it was clear that the other prominent generals by his side listened to his every word as if he were some voice speaking on behalf of divinity. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the two of you. You both made time to come to my humble abode and on such short notice, nonetheless. It is with this in mind that I promise not to waste your time, as I understand it is just as valuable to you as it is to me. I'll be frank. This war in Libya will spark our greatest fears in no more than 3 years. By mid-1914, Europe will be at war. I am certain of it, and I regret to inform you both that the entire world will be dragged into hell with us. My reason for inviting you both here was so that we may jointly come up with a strategy to defeat our enemies in the most efficient way possible. I won't lie to you. The Kaiser and his staff have a plan in motion should war erupt. But no plan survives wholly intact after making contact with the enemy, and because of this, I wanted to speculate with you both about what we will do when the gunfire begins. This meeting was quite frankly teetering on the edge of treason, even among allies. Revealing critical strategies on the precipice of a major war was not exactly kindly looked upon by those in power. Even so, Bruno needed to know whether or not Austro-Hungary and Russia were ready for what awaited them all within less than half a decade. And because of this, Mikhail was quick to speak up, ensuring that they all vowed secrecy during the conversation they were having. It was, after all, taking place in Bruno's personal office, which was soundproofed. The only witnesses to this discussion were the three of them, as Bruno had expressly forbidden any interruption during this time, unless it was an absolute emergency. Before we speak, I want to vow, upon whatever oaths you two hold sacred, that not a word of this discussion will leave this room. As far as the Tsar knows, this is a social gathering among friends, and I would prefer to keep it that way. Bruno nodded his head with an equally severe expression on his face, placing his hand over his heart as he swore that he would not under any circumstances leak the details of this conversation to anyone, not even those he trusted with his life. I, Bruno von Zehntner, swear upon the continued health and prosperity of my family and my fatherland, that I shall never say a word in my life about what we are about to discuss here today, unless first given express permission by the two of you to do so, even if I should be personally interrogated by my family or my Kaiser. Similar oaths were taken by the other two generals, who both had as severe of an expression on their faces as they did so, before finally the conversation between them began. Mikhail was the first to speak up, asking the question that both he and Svetozar were so desperate to know. So what exactly is this plan of yours, and what role do we play in it? The conversation was a lengthy one, and that was just the first part. To put it simply, Bruno's plan was more detailed than the official one adopted by the Kaiser and his general staff. After all, they did not necessarily know exactly who they would be fighting and under what circumstances. But Bruno more or less had an idea. He started by discussing the fortifications built in the West to halt any French invasion of Germany. Britain's potential joining of the war would be counteracted by sinking their ships in the Atlantic with the U-boats Germany was already producing, and would have hundreds of by the outbreak of the war, leaving the French to effectively send wave after wave of men to their deaths against German border fortifications, and in doing so, by the bulk of the German army time to push into Serbia and Italy with their allies in the Russian army. Hence, why Bruno had spent half a decade investing in an infrastructure project that substantially updated the railways between the three neighboring empires. Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian troops could be effectively mobilized and deployed to the borders of Italy and Serbia at record speeds. In addition to this, Bruno had marked Romania as a potential adversary. The King of Romania had yet to take an official stance and would die within the first year of the war, leaving a relative as a potential wild card. Bruno had tried to intimidate the young man into not entering the war, and instead working to supply oil to the imperial powers, but this had yet to bear fruit, and such a small encounter years prior may not have held the same level of dread today as it had then. Nevertheless, after hearing all the lengths Bruno had gone to on his own to prepare for the march south, both Mikhail and Svetozer looked at Bruno as if they were incredibly lucky to be on his side, before beginning to speak of the extensive preparations their respective nations had made. Chapter 180. Echoes of the Forthcoming War Part 2. It was not surprising to Bruno that Russia had spent the last half a decade focusing on rapid industrialization efforts and modernization of its industry. In fact, as a prince of Russia, Bruno himself had invested heavily in at least one of these things. When it came to the extraction, refinement, and manufacture of natural resources into usable goods, Bruno had spent a pretty sum acquiring all the means to do so within Russia, contributing to the growth of its economy, and more importantly, providing many employment opportunities to the millions of people displaced by the Russian Civil War. He did not realize it yet, but Bruno was more beloved in Russia than he was in Germany at the moment by the people, the Orthodox Church, the nobility, and even the House of Romanov. He was seen as an exemplary man of virtue and might, a rare combination in this world. Bruno had, after all, been given a lot of credit for Heinrich's humanitarian efforts, as it was his financial backing and political ties to the Kaiser that saw these efforts reach their fullest extent. The disaster that could have consumed Russia was largely avoided by this fact. And while the investment in Russian land and industry was for his own benefit and the benefit of the German Reich, the byproduct was providing a livable wage to many formerly displaced Russian families. It was because of all this investment that Bruno was not the least surprised that Russia had made significant gains in terms of industrialization as well as modernization of its military. Not only had their old inventory of obsolete artillery been completely replaced with new and modern designs, many of which had not come into creation until 1915 during Bruno's past life, but the effectiveness of the Maxim machine gun had left a resounding mark on the Tsar and his generals, causing the men to manufacture thousands of such weapons per year. Currently, in the year 1911, it was no exaggeration to say that the Russian Empire held the second most number of machine guns actively seeing use in their armed forces. In addition to this, steel helmets were now issued to every soldier along with their modern uniforms, which made use of earthy tones to better blend in with the background. As far as infantry weapons issued to the Russian army, they were more or less in line with Bruno's past life. The Mosin Nagant 1891 was still the primary service rifle of all soldiers. However, what was interesting was that at the behest of the German army, the nations of the alliance were requested to at the very least perform trials with weapons converted to 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser. Germany's desire was to simplify the lines of production and logistics between the three European nations of the four-nation military alliance. The result of which was that the Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies alike had shifted from their own proprietary cartridges to weapons chambered in German ammunition. Naturally, It wasn't just rifles and machine guns converted to 7.92 by 57, but handguns converted to 9 by 19 mm Luger as well, with the Austro-Hungarians adopting the Steyr M1912 as their primary sidearm, but in 9 by 19 mm Luger instead of 9 by 23 Steyr. In addition to this, the standard Austro-Hungarian Steyr Mannlicher M1895 straight pull bolt action rifle was converted into a variant that made use of the German 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge. As a result, the three nations had more or less begun producing the same ammunition. This mindset had also shifted over to munitions used in everything from artillery to naval guns. By 1914, every weapon used by the three powers would share munitions compatibility, and the three industrial empires would also be producing their own munitions domestically. While this might not sound like a large deal to the uninitiated, this was enormous, as ammo commonality was not a concept understood by the world until after the end of the Second World War. More than anything, logistics won wars, and when the three imperial powers were all using the same ammunition and producing it domestically with their own infrastructure, it meant they could share munitions during great times of strife. Truthfully, Bruno wanted more than this, as the different means of feeding each weapon type used by each of the three armies was still proprietary, which itself complicated the logistics network between them. But that was an issue fixed by time, and at the start of the war, the imperial powers would have plenty of it. Hence why Bruno ultimately decided to fix that before the outbreak of the next Great War, assuming that would even happen in this timeline. The meeting lasted well into the dreadful hours of the night, with them taking only brief periods of respite to take care of necessary bodily functions. After which, the three generals sat around the fireplace within Bruno's office while seated in finely upholstered leather chairs, drinking exquisite spirits and smoking expensive cigars while summarizing the content of their discussion. I fear when our enemies advance against us, they will have been caught entirely by surprise at the exceptional preparations we have made for this forthcoming war. This was stated by the Russian general, who was far more certain about their victory in the coming conflict than he had previously felt before this meeting. Naturally, the Austro-Hungarian general agreed with this sentiment, having provided many insights into the defenses that would hold back the French and potentially British armies. As long as you take my recommendations into consideration and adjust them accordingly to your needs, I am ashamed to say, but I feel like weeping for the French and British should they really be so foolish as to pursue a war with our great alliance. Bruno couldn't help but agree with his two comrades in arms. He knew calling this meeting would be beneficial, not only to put the two men at ease regarding the growing tensions of the world, but to learn more thoroughly of his allies' preparations. As the last thing he wanted was for Germany to fight this war for a second time and still be expected to carry his entire team to the finish line. But at the same time, Bruno was thankful to his Austro-Hungarian counterpart, who pointed out several things that could be used over the course of the next 3 years to further improve upon the fortifications already established on Germany's western and northern borders. Still, Bruno would be remiss if he did not remind these men that complacency would be the death of them. And thus, he ended this secret meeting with some final words spoken in a grim and sobering tone. Remember, not a word of what we have said on this day shall be uttered aloud outside these hallowed walls without first gaining the express permission of everyone present to witness this discussion. I would also like to take a moment to remind you both that though it is good to feel confident in the odds that clearly favor our great nations, do not ever become so arrogant that you overlook the enemy and their intentions. One must always be prepared and adaptable for the circumstances they may find themselves in. Continue to monitor the situation and prepare for the forthcoming war. And when the day finally arrives, I look forward to marching upon Belgrade with the two of you. Once Serbia has been taken out, Rome is next. And then we can finally force the French to realize that their time as a great power ended in 1871 when we trounced their last emperor. Cheers, boys, and may God have mercy on our souls for the sins we shall soon commit. The three men were far less joyous after hearing Bruno's warning. Nevertheless, they drank their fill of fine spirits before each heading off to the quarters which Bruno had allotted for their stay. Bruno himself returned to his room and lay down next to his wife, already in a deep sleep. He gripped his hands firmly around her waist and said one simple phrase before falling asleep. I Love You, Heidi. Chapter 181, The Red Baron Part 1. Trials for the adoption of the He-51 biplane had been concluded. Even now, as the year 1911 entered its final season, Germany had managed to manufacture thousands of biplanes. The problem wasn't manufacturing these metal birds. No, that was easy and cheap to do, even on such a large scale intended for a global conflict. Rather, the real expense in the fielding of aircraft was not only maintenance and logistic support, but primarily the fostering of those brave souls who would ride them into battle. That's right, founding a dedicated air school was expensive, and so was training pilots. One couldn't just raise a single crop of these knights of the sky. They would need to be consistently trained over the years. After all, many would certainly die in war, and those who didn't would eventually retire. Even then, it usually took a year or perhaps even longer to properly train these men, who would be the final exemplars of the ancient chivalric tradition in this world. They were the living legacy of a long-forgotten lineage of warriors who once rode on horseback at breakneck speeds, crashing into one another in an attempt to win glory for God, king, and country. Such was the spirit not only at the German Air Academy, which was the first of its kind, though it was not its official name, but also among the ranks of those who had already earned their wings. Saying that Bruno had a functional knowledge of dogfighting tactics was an overstatement at best. Did he understand what dogfighting was, and the general principles behind how generations of pilots had learned to properly engage and eliminate their enemies? Even that would be overestimating his knowledge in this regard. He was an army officer, one who was so good at his job that in his twilight years he was tasked with training the next generation of general staff for the Heer of the Bundeswehr in his past life. Close air support and how it changed the battlefield were more of his expertise when it came to the proper tactical and strategic employment of aircraft. As for the battles that took place above himself and his troops in the sky, that was not his area of expertise, much like the wars waged between steel ships on the seas. Sure, he had more knowledge on how to utilize these weapons than even the greatest minds of the era, especially when it came to the importance of air supremacy on a modern battlefield. But to say he was a genius in either naval or aerial-based warfare was incredibly far-fetched. Even so, what limited knowledge he had in such pursuits had already been given to those better suited to it than himself, such as the use of wolf-pack tactics for submarines to the admiralty of the Kaiserlich Marine. As for the use of dogfighting tactics, only the most rudimentary knowledge was given to the pilots who founded the German Air Academy. Currently, Bruno stood on the ground outside an airfield that was now under the direct authority of the German army, one he had invested significant sums in establishing for the testing of his own aircraft. He, of course, had been properly compensated for his efforts and was more than happy to hand over such land to the German army if it meant it could be used more effectively in the future war. In the sky above were several He-51s, engaging in a mock battle. They were all painted in accordance with those used by the Reichsverteidigung during the final days of the Second World War in Bruno's past life. These were the most advanced paint schemes of the era, featuring an eggshell blue underbelly, which blended in very well with the color of the sky over Central Europe for those flak guns gazing upon the planes from the ground below. It also had a fairly decent camouflage paint scheme of green, earthly tones on the top and sides of the aircraft to blend in with the spring and summertime foliage of Central Europe if one were gazing upon the aircraft from above. In addition to this, the actual propeller of the biplanes and its mount were painted in a white and black spiral pattern, which disrupted the overall shape of the propeller in a way that made it difficult to detect in the background. The basic science behind it was similar to how a zebra's fur pattern concealed it from mosquitoes. It did this because the coat reflects light in alternately polarized and non-polarized patterns, making it more difficult to single out the propeller from the rest of the aircraft, which was painted in camouflage. Even so, as Bruno gazed through his binoculars on the ground while conversing with the general who had been placed in command of the Luftstreicher FTE, he could still detect the planes as they utilized basic maneuvers learned from his knowledge of future aerial warfare against one another in a mock display of battles. Among this first crop of pilots, there was a decent number who proved rather exceptional despite being the first qualified fighter pilots in this world's history. One in particular had scored over a dozen kills within the rule set throughout the last week of mock battles. and he had continued to increase that number today. This exceptional skill made Bruno immediately take interest in the man, as he showed a rare sign of emotion with a proud smirk on his face before asking General Hermann von der Leith-Thomsen, who in Bruno's past life had been the man who created the German Air Force, about the identity of the pilot in question. I have been observing that man for quite some time now, and I have to ask, what is his identity? The man Bruno was speaking to had created the German Air Force during his past life and was its current commander in this timeline. He too had a proud smile on his face as he boasted about the pilot he considered among his most capable. That man there? His name is Lieutenant Manfred von Richthofen. He was among the first volunteers to join the Luftstreicher, FTE. Although we have many men who are proving to be exceptionally capable in piloting these aircraft, I have to say he is perhaps chief among them. Bruno was not the least bit surprised by the young man's identity when he learned precisely who he was. Manfred von Richthofen was perhaps the most infamous fighter ace in human history. While there were others, such as Erich Hartmann, who had proven superior in their success during the Second World War decades after Richthofen's death in 1918, it was arguable that more people were aware of the moniker the Red Baron than they were of the Black Devil. And it was only because Bruno was so familiar with the exploits of the Red Baron that he realized just how close they truly were to the outbreak of an event that had more or less been the cause of Western civilization's downfall in his past life. Because of this, Bruno surprised the general next to him with a comment that was unexpected. After all, Bruno had a surly reputation among his peers. Though the men who had served beneath him swore that they would follow the man to hell and back if he asked it of them, those who had not experienced his authority considered Bruno a cold and antisocial person. For him to go out of his way to request a meeting with someone who was not of supreme political importance was indeed a rare occasion, thus explaining the general's visible shock when he heard Bruno say the words, "Manfred von Richthofen, huh? I would very much like to meet this young lieutenant. That is, of course, after the exercise is done, and only if you permit it." Bruno was a very hard man to gain the favor of. He cared little for meaningless gestures of friendship, nor was he at all fond of mindless flattery. He was a man who valued competency, intelligence, diligence, ambition, and most of all, loyalty. It was hard for many to live up to these standards, especially if they never had a chance to display such qualities to begin with. Seeing this as an opportunity to please a man who had the Kaiser's attention in a way that only his chief of staff shared, General Hermann von der Leith-Thomsen was quick to grant this request. "Of course, after the exercise is over, I will have the lieutenant greet you properly. You have my word." Thus, the two of them continued to watch the exercise in silence until a meeting could be arranged between the Red Scourge and the man who would one day become known throughout the annals of human history by the prestigious title of the Red Baron. Chapter 182, The Red Baron Part 2. Manfred von Richthofen was a legendary figure from Bruno's past life. He was among the first aviators in world history and had scored a resounding number of kills, making him also among humanity's greatest fighter aces. Due to his heritage as a minor nobleman and the awards he had been granted in his life for his service to Kaiser and fatherland, there were some romantics among historians who fondly referred to the man as the last knight of the sky. But it would be many a year before Manfred gained such a prestigious reputation. The Great War was still at most 3 years away, and it would take even longer before Germany's rivals could properly field fighter pilots and planes. Instead, Manfred was just 19 years old at the moment. He was barely an adult by modern standards, and by the standards of the era, he had yet to even qualify for that, as the age of majority within the German Reich was 21 years. Even so, he was already an active duty serviceman within the German army and a full-fledged officer in the Kaiser's service as a fighter pilot. Yet when Bruno approached him, the atmosphere could only be described as weird. Both men had a similar reaction. Bruno himself was gazing upon a legendary figure from his past life, one he had never had the opportunity to meet, as he was born decades after Manfred's death. The Red Baron was a figure who invoked a sense of respect on levels that almost bordered on reverence. Yet Manfred had done nothing to earn this degree of respect from Bruno. Thus, he had to force his naturally anxious heart to remain as calm as a tranquil forest. And though Bruno didn't realize it, Manfred felt a similar level of admiration for Bruno. Bruno was already quite the legendary and iconic figure in the German Reich. He was the youngest Generaloberst in history. Born from a family of Junkers, he rose to become a prominent figure not just in Germany, but on the global stage. His image was carved into the minds of young men who wished to prove themselves in war. Barely into his 30s, Bruno held the third highest rank a man could obtain in the German army. In addition to this, he was a veteran of 3 wars, performing admirably in each of them, so much so that the Tsar had awarded him the noble title of prince within the Russian Empire. His military achievements were only outmatched by his pursuits in business, amassing a substantial fortune that would put the royal treasuries of several minor kingdoms to shame, and in only the span of a decade, no less. Bruno was considered a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, and a large supporter of the church. To a young man like Manfred, who was just starting his military career, it was an equally daunting task to stand before Bruno, whom he held in such regard as a role model. Bruno decided to break the awkward silence as he saluted the man and tried his best to instill a sense of calmness within himself as he met one of the men he had admired since the childhood of his past life. Lieutenant Manfred von Richthofen, I have been watching your performance. You seem to fly exceptionally well. I have to ask, what do you think of the He-51? How does she fare in the sky? To say that Manfred was surprised that Bruno knew his identity was most certainly an understatement. But as he looked over at the smirk on the face of the general in charge of the Luftstreicher, FTE, he couldn't help but surmise that the man had informed Bruno of his identity. It took the young fighter pilot a moment to fully understand Bruno's question before he spoke of the aircraft. I'm not going to lie, sir, the plane handles exceptionally well, and the controls are very intuitive. I have seen photos of what we will be contending with should we go to war with Italy, and I must say that our planes are of significantly superior quality compared to our rivals on the global stage. There was no doubt about this, as Bruno had been responsible for introducing the He-51 into the world far earlier than it should have been. The enemy would be flying wood and canvas planes that Bruno would accurately refer to as death traps. His pilots, however, would be flying interwar planes built from aluminum. They were much sturdier, safer, and faster than their counterparts. In addition to this, the enemy would have to wait several years before machine guns were integrated into the fuselage, instead relying on a dedicated gunner to attack the enemy. While Bruno's planes made use of machine guns with incendiary rounds, which the pilot could fire via a direct line of sight, Germany's rivals would first have their gunners use semi-automatic rifles that were incapable of being used in the trenches due to reliability issues before shifting to heavy machine guns mounted on top of the gunner's seat. It was only at the end of the war that planes began to use integrated machine guns capable of being fired by pilots, and by that time, whatever air force they had managed to muster under emergency circumstances would have long since been blown out of the sky. With all of this in mind, Bruno couldn't help but agree with Manfred's assessment as he made a friendly gesture that was unusual for him. Bruno placed his hand on the young man's shoulder and nodded with a confident smile on his face, assuring Manfred that he expected great things to come from his career. Indeed, but even without such advantages, a man of your expertise is destined to achieve greatness when the war to come finally arrives. I look forward to closely following your military career, Lieutenant. Do not disappoint me. That is all Bruno said before swiftly departing from the airfield. He did not realize it, but he had given Manfred a very large boost in confidence. Bruno would, of course, begin to keep an eye on several major names from history as the war ever closer approached. After all, Manfred von Richthofen was not the only legend that would be forged in this war, and many others who would make a name for themselves during the upcoming Great War would be destined for a level of infamy only associated with history's greatest villains. That is, of course, if Bruno failed in his goals of preventing such a future from occurring in the first place. Who knows? With his interference in the timeline, it was possible that these names would instead be heralded as Germany's greatest heroes. Nobody knew what the future really held for the world and its people. Not even Bruno, even if he himself had come from a future era in a different timeline. The butterfly effect had only just begun to shape the world in subtle ways, and its lasting impact on the timeline would be far greater than Bruno ever realized. Chapter 183, Why We Fight. The war in Italy continued to progress at a rate that Bruno found to be not at all surprising, and yet still somewhat alarming. By the year's end, the Ottomans were sure to capitulate. Though General Caneva was praised within international newspaper outlets for his bold, decisive, and aggressive strategy which crushed the Ottoman defense while outnumbered and outgunned, Bruno knew that this likely was not the case. He had done some of his own investigating into what happened outside Shar al-Shad, and sure enough, the change in the timeline had not resulted from any major shift in the infamous general's personality. Rather, it was an act of insubordination from a figure who was unknown to Bruno in his previous life. This man was the officer in charge of the Italian brigade, holding the line while under orders to wait for reinforcements. He was, in all honesty, a figure unknown to Bruno from his past life, and because of this, Bruno thought perhaps he was a threat that needed to be removed. The reality of the situation was far from Bruno's worst fears. Colonel Giovanni Colombo was not a reincarnated individual like Bruno's paranoia had compelled him to investigate. Rather, he was a nameless officer in the ranks of the Italian army who history likely forgot the name of, as in Bruno's past life, he had not made any significant contributions to the war effort. In fact, according to Bruno's investigation, he received a battlefield promotion after the initial landing to the rank of colonel, likely as a result of the butterfly effect. Whoever was supposed to be in his position had died in the earliest days of the war, being replaced by this nameless figure. And it was because of this that his impatient and daring character led to a major shift in the war's timeline. While Bruno would continue to monitor this newly emerged face, he was instead more focused on General Caneva's newfound prestige. Obviously, the direct insubordination by the colonel beneath his command had been covered up. The man responsible for this victory was likely given leniency in exchange for the credit being stripped from him. This changed things, as General Caneva's poor performance in the war basically stripped him of any battlefield command by the end of the war and brought back to the Italian homeland to basically serve a desk job for the rest of his career. He had been given a promotion, but it was in name only. But now he was likely to be considered a far more capable general than he actually was. And if that happened, Italy would be even worse off when the time for a war with the German Reich became a reality. This had, in some ways, benefited Bruno and his ambitions, but only mildly so. With the preparations he had made, he believed defeating the Italian army in the Alps would take a single decisive battle. And from there, it was a short march into Rome. Whether or not they had one more incompetent general in a position of power really did not change too much of his overall plans for this world. Instead, Bruno's attention was primarily being focused on the 1912 elections. Sure, the bulk of the fun had not yet even truly begun. The election was in the early stages, and the primaries had not even concluded. But with the current failure of Woodrow Wilson's campaign, he would need a miracle to emerge as the front-runner for the Democratic Party. Simply put, Bruno had crippled the man before he could even make it to the general election. And finally, on December 21st, 1911, Bruno received the greatest gift he could possibly obtain on his 32nd birthday. Woodrow Wilson, having had his reputation soiled by slander and libel of the most heinous kind, resulting in him losing nearly all of his backers, had dropped out of the race and was among the first candidates to do so. The man who had led the United States during the Great War of Bruno's past life had thrown in the towel and ceased his candidacy before the primaries had truly begun. Bruno had won a significant battle, and yet the war for the soul of Western civilization was still inconclusive. This victory surely sparked a moment of celebration, but was in no way the end of what was to come. Without Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic nominee, it meant another figure would take his place, one who may have a chance of winning, even with how slight that currently may be. Bruno silently prayed to the Lord God Almighty that Champ Clark would be the Democratic nominee because he, unlike Woodrow Wilson, had until the very end opposed the U.S. entry into the war during Bruno's past life. Either way, it was starting to appear that the most likely candidates to be nominated towards the two American political parties were both opposed to entering the war, especially if Bruno prevented the two major sparks that had caused this in his past life. All he needed to worry about was the wild card that was Theodore Roosevelt. Thought Bruno respected the 26th President of the United States far more than he did Woodrow Wilson or the other president to share Teddy's last name. The man was the type who was highly likely to get involved in the war effort or at least do everything he could. This is, after all, the man who resigned from his post as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to go volunteer to fight in the Spanish-American War because he saw it as an opportunity to prove himself as a man. In addition to this, he was the man who had played a large part in the growth of American overseas territories. If the worst came to worst, and Theodore Roosevelt was elected, Bruno would have to try to persuade him to side with the imperial powers rather than the Allies. But that was a worry for another time. For now, Bruno sat at the head of his children, being sung to by his wife and children as they celebrated his 32nd year in this world. It was a surreal moment as candles were lit on his birthday cake, and he gazed into the flames and the happy smiles on his family's faces as they sang to him. Bruno realized that he had never enjoyed such happiness in his previous life, and just how long it had been since he had first appeared in this new lease on life. In his past life, the best memories he had were in his childhood, and even then it was not as if they were as fulfilling as the 32 years he had lived in this life. Memories he had long since relegated to the back of his mind came surfacing within the boundaries of his mind's eye. All the while he struggled to hold back the tears of joy that were trying their best to flood out. He had nobody who had ever cared about him enough to go through the efforts of preparing such a magnificent multi-layered birthday cake. Every ounce of effort had been done by Heidi, who had dismissed the kitchen staff for the day as she personally wanted to cook every ounce of food to properly celebrate her husband's birthday. Her two daughters had also joined in and helped to some extent, albeit mildly so. The years that Bruno and Heidi had spent together now came flooding back to him. From the first moment they met in his study to their childhood together, where he thought of the young girl as nothing more than a nuisance getting in the way of his studies. Nearly 3 decades of memories together flooded his mind, reminding Bruno of what he was working so hard to preserve: family, folk, God, Kaiser, and fatherland. Things that had all been erased from his previous life for the common man were still present in this world, and he was the only one who could keep it that way. But more than anything, Bruno did not want his kids to live in a world without such things. Because of this, he couldn't help but lift his mug as he drank a specialty Doppelbock beer whose taste complemented the chocolate in the birthday cake perfectly, all while thanking his wife and daughters for the effort they had put into making this birthday a special occasion for him. I must confess, I was not expecting today's festivities to be so moving. I know I don't say it as much as I should, but thank you all for the love and support you have shown me these years. And I look forward to another year with you all, including the newest addition to our family. Heidi then walked over and hugged Bruno, kissing him on the cheek before allowing his son and daughters to also display their familial affection and respect for their father. After which Bruno cut the cake into enough slices for the lot of them, and said his thanks to God for giving him such a beautiful life, one which he would rather die the most brutal death defending than to ever see it slip from his grasp. Chapter 184: Quantity versus Quality. Germany and its alliance were not the only nation preparing for war. In fact, the French had made substantial investments in machine guns over the years, especially since the Iron Division proved how effective they were in the trenches outside St. Petersburg and Tsaritsyn. And while the level of technological progression had increased ever so slightly on the global stage due to Bruno's interference in the timeline, some things had actually veered off into a less desirable path, at least for the French. As previously mentioned, the French army had a serious issue with machine guns leading up to the Great War in Bruno's past life. Aside from the paltry sum of such destructive devices actually employed in their army, they also did not create a machine gun that was remotely reliable enough to chew through the mud and blood of the trenches until the fabled Hotchkiss was adopted in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of the infamous global conflict. This meant that at the start of the Great War, France's limited machine gun arsenal still largely consisted of those two designs derived from the horrifically unreliable Bang gas system. However, this was a lesson they had also failed to understand in this life. In Bruno's past life, France and many other powers had routinely refined their machine gun designs until creating something that was functional for the purposes of sustained fire during trench warfare. But that was not the case in this life. Germany had, after all, as a result of Bruno's actions, begun mass-producing a variation of the Maxim machine gun much earlier than they had in their past life. The result of this was that after St. Petersburg and the brutal domination the then Iron Brigade had over the significantly larger Red Army, there was a spur in demand across the world for similar weapons. France, having never truly adopted the Maxim, instead began development of their own machine gun, resulting in the Putos Model 1905 machine gun. This meant that the demand for quantity of machine guns had overridden that of quality. As a result, France had significantly more machine guns in their arsenal than they had in Bruno's previous life at the current moment. But these machine guns could barely get through 5 straight rounds before bogging down the crew operating them. This meant that they were actually preventing 3 or more potential riflemen from providing sustained fire against an enemy charge for every machine gun employed on the battlefield. And France had built thousands of these machine guns in preparation for the war. Even now, as they were only just beginning to realize how flawed their machine guns were, they did not even think about changing production lines to the older Model 1900 Hotchkiss, of which the infamous 1914 machine gun of the same name was a variation and had even seen service in prior wars. Leon, who was still stuck at the rank of brigadier general and was seen more as a propaganda piece than a capable military commander, was currently standing outside the border fortifications that had been constructed between Germany and France. For the sake of showing that these fortifications had not in the slightest bit intimidated the French army, France had deployed an entire division to the border for military exercises. And this division was currently being observed by the Germans on the other side. Entirely unaware that the man he was posed as the French rival of was standing on the other side of the border, gazing down upon him and his men who were desperately trying to get these poorly conceived machine guns to fire reliably, was none other than Bruno. Winter had come, and his birthday had passed. Even the Christmas celebrations were gone. Instead, Bruno stood dressed in a stylish military greatcoat, emblazoned with the symbols of his rank as a generalaeburst upon the French army below. And he, of course, had taken notice of Leon. Both men had not seen each other since the start of the last decade. They had both gained positions of power since then and had both been deployed to at least one other battlefield. And while beneath Bruno's greatcoat was a series of medals, of which only 2 belonged to his native nation, Leon was also highly decorated, but exclusively in the medals of the French Republic and its armed forces. Both men were silently gazing at a cigarette, one with a stoic expression that reflected his emotionless character, while the other contrasted with a hostile gaze and a wicked sneer. Not towards Bruno, as Leon was entirely unaware that he was being watched, but rather to his own men, at whom he made intimidating gestures and bestial shouts as he reprimanded them for failing to display the proper might of the French army. The reality was this mediocre display of force was just that, by no fault of the brave soldiers who tried to make the damn thing work. Rather, it was the Putos machine gun itself, as Bruno expected, that was the problem. In fact, he knew this from the very moment he saw the French army lining up hundreds of such guns that they were liable to jam every 3 to 5 rounds within the snow and mud of the trenches. This was only compounded by the fact that they had to rely on the 3+ men who operated the weapons to work tirelessly to strip the malfunction, whatever that may be, before feeding another round into the tray, only to perform the exact same action again in the next 5 seconds. Bruno would be laughing at the French in their mass production of what was possibly the world's worst heavy machine gun ever put into service if it weren't for the fact the price that would be paid for these failures would be done so with a sea of blood. Did Bruno hate the French? Well, no more than any other German of the era. He, of course, despised the French Republic and the politicians whose pettiness and short-sightedness saw to the abominable Treaty of Versailles, which itself was responsible for all the woes of the Western world in his previous life. But the individual men who would go out and die in the millions for such an ignoble cause were no more to blame than the men who stormed into Poland 21 years after the Great War came to an end, and in doing so ushered in a second and far more terrible world conflict. No, Bruno held no hatred for these soldiers whose names would soon be written on a mass of tombstones and wooden crosses. Rather, he felt pity for them, not only because they would all be food for the worms soon enough, but also because when the Germans finally won this war and marched through the French countryside, the widows and daughters of these men would line up in droves and throw themselves at the German soldiers who had killed them. Such happened twice in Bruno's past life, once in 1914 and again in 1940. After seeing the way Leon berated the troops beneath his command for failures that were not their own, Bruno simply shook his head and commented on it, pointing out the shameful display to the men who stood next to him. "You see that man, that general shouting obscenities at his troops?" The soldier looked over at Bruno with a stern gaze, one that was also filled with anxiety. He refused to believe that someone of Bruno's status would simply speak to him for the sake of engaging in nonsensical banter. Because of this, the enlisted soldier immediately assumed Bruno was about to give him a critical order, one that might accidentally start a war. And because of this, he was treating Bruno's words as if they were more severe than the 10 Commandments given to man by God himself. That is until Bruno finished his statement after exhaling a long plume of smoke from his cigarette before stomping it out beneath his boots. "You have my permission to put a bullet in my brain if I ever try to do something so contemptible as to try and hold you or any of your comrades responsible for the failures of the engineers who designed such a piece of shit, let alone the politicians who were either corrupt or stupid enough to approve the adoption of such a monstrosity for service in the first place. My God, that man is a disgrace to the rank he so proudly wears on his shoulders." Bruno then walked away without saying another word. The soldier Bruno was speaking to, as well as the other men in the unit who were standing on guard nearby, men who had heard the entire conversation, were silent for a long time before breaking out into jovial laughter, with one of the men saying, "Holy shit, I didn't expect the Red Scourge of all people to say such a thing. I mean, I thought I was the only one thinking that French general was a bastard, but he just outright said it." Bruno's statement of condemnation towards Leon and the way he treated his soldiers spread throughout the camp, with his words becoming more and more exaggerated and humorous by the time they circled back to Bruno's ears. Nobody expected that he was rather serious when he said such words. Only those who had served with him before would know how much he hated incompetent or foolish leadership, especially those who treated their own soldiers poorly without valid reason to do so. After all, there was a quote which Bruno generally believed and aspired to follow as a military leader: "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death." Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Chapter 185. The Balkan Wars begin. To say that Germany had made preparations that would astonish their rival powers on the global stage would be the most severe understatement of the century. After extensive testing and trial by error, the Type XXI U-boat was finally launched. Or should I say it was an improved variation of the world's first submarine designed to primarily operate underwater. The first of the months following the completion of the mechanical computerized targeting system, which was arguably the hardest part of the U-boat to develop. With the submarine's hull being manufactured via prefabricated sections, Bruno had managed to streamline the process to where it took a mere 90 days on average to fully commission a single U-boat. And considering his shipyards in Danzig and Hamburg were capable of producing multiple submarines at once, this meant that every 3 months, the German Navy received a dozen or so U-boats per shipyard. At most, Bruno's shipyards could produce roughly 50 U-boats a year. Due to Germany's limited coastline, he only had 2 shipyards, albeit they were significant in size and scale. So much so that each shipyard could produce a dozen U-boats every 3 months and half a dozen destroyers every 5 months. In addition to this, Bruno's other factories were manufacturing every component that went into these vessels, including munitions and targeting computers. These targeting computers could also be retrofitted onto existing warships of any size and scale. The reason Bruno had focused on U-boats and destroyers was twofold. 1, he had to start shipyards from scratch, which was a years-long process in and of itself. 2, there were only so many vessels he could build in a single year. When it came to winning the war, protecting maritime trade, and destroying rival merchant ships on the high seas was an easy route to victory, especially if he could freely attack enemy shipping and protect his own with relative impunity. Sure, such vessels could also be employed in fleet battles to great effect, but at the end of the day, it was a matter of perspective. Perhaps if his family had already been invested in naval endeavors when he was born, producing more state-of-the-art battleships and cruisers would be a route to victory. But ultimately, he had come from an army family, and because of this, Bruno had limited time and resources to establish the best naval assets he could, hence why he had gone for U-boats and destroyers. Speaking of the new destroyers, they had already launched several of such ships. And while they were decades more advanced than their rivals on the sea, such vessels were small and overlooked by the enemy, as in this era, the dreadnought was the most prestigious vessel. Hence, despite being far more than just a torpedo boat, and instead a dedicated destroyer of which there were only a limited number of such warships in existence today, the British Empire and the French Republic paid little attention to the Zerst, rare 1911 class of vessels. Something that would prove to be a major and costly oversight on their part. But Bruno paid little attention to the naval arms race that was still taking place, as maritime warfare was something he had a very limited impact on. No, the war on the land and in the skies was his expertise, and hence why he was so focused on the Balkans as the new year came around. Italy had demolished the Ottoman army in North Africa with record speed, prompting multiple armed insurrections to occur across the Ottoman territories that they still held within European lands. Insurrections supported by the Balkan League, a union of the Eastern Orthodox kingdoms of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro, all of whom wanted the Turks out of Europe once and for all. Bruno cared little for the Balkans other than the role they needed to play in shaping the coming century. But if there was one grievance he had about how things had settled in the area during the course of his past life, it was that the Greeks, for various reasons, had failed to utilize the opportunity presented to them during the first half of the century to reclaim Constantinople. Because of this, Bruno had decided to bless them with a gift in this new timeline, one that only he would know he had given them. Sitting in his office, drinking from a cup of coffee, Bruno read the latest reports of what was transpiring in the Balkans. The First Balkan War was on the verge of breaking out, as the Ottomans had begun scrambling troops to the region in the hopes of suppressing the ongoing revolts by the native Europeans who had been under their thumb for far too long. Bruno had decided that now was the perfect time to advance the Orthodox interests in the region, particularly in reclaiming Constantinople, something that, while not resulting from the Balkan Wars, could be gained from the end of the coming Great War for the Greeks, should Bruno play his hand correctly. And because of this, the man had a sinister sneer on his face as he commented on what was about to happen within the ancient Roman city, all because of his own machinations. "I'm sorry, Mehmed, but it would appear that I need to make you a martyr in order to galvanize the Ottomans against the imperial powers. After all, Constantinople belongs to Christianity, and you Turks have occupied our holy city for far too long." After Heidi weaponized German intelligence against the Black Hand, what remained of their leadership went underground. Bruno had no way of knowing it, but his wife had bought him some valuable time. Sure, they were plotting against the Habsburgs, but their means of actually lashing out were diminished by the casualties they had sustained in recent months, especially with the death of Apis, who was a major figure among their ranks. And now, the Balkan Wars had more or less begun, with the Balkan League supplying rebels in those few European regions still under Ottoman control. And while nobody knew it, Bruno also supplied these movements with black market German arms via unofficial channels. It was because of this that today, January 27, 1912, a remarkable event was about to occur, one that would shake the world altogether, and it happened in the streets of Constantinople. Currently, Sultan Mehmed V was stuck in traffic, his motorcade held up by a mixture of automobiles imported from the German Reich and horse carriages used by the people of the Ottoman capital. He thought nothing of the unusual traffic, as he cursed to his driver about the whole ordeal. "For Allah's sake, can you please do something about this peasant rabble which has us boxed in these streets? Do they not know I could have their heads removed for this insolence?" The driver wanted to mention that the Sultan was no longer an autocrat after what happened a few years prior, and how he no longer possessed the power to just kill people as he pleased. But the moment he opened his mouth, a bullet flew through his windshield and the gaping hole where the words were about to escape from. Gunfire crackled only after the shot had been made, and it was not just a single round. Rather, several shots fired off in the distance. Various automatic weapons sprayed the motorcade and those who sat inside it. The shots came from the carbines within the hands of various men, garbed in civilian clothing. The only distinction between them and the people on the streets, who had begun to panic, scream, and run amok as a result of the ongoing chaos, were the black bandanas concealing their facial features. bandanas that were crudely painted with a chi-ro. They made use of Mauser C96 automatic carbines, the same overall design that Bruno's Iron Division used as a replacement for dedicated submachine guns during the Russian Civil War nearly a decade prior. These weapons had long since entered the international black market and were favored by both revolutionary groups and gangsters alike due to their compact design, detachable 20-round magazine, and supreme rate of fire, which were ideal in urban settings such as this. The attackers had deployed from the cars which surrounded the Sultan's motorcade and began opening fire before anybody could figure out what was happening, dumping their bullets into the cars and the bodies of those inside. It was only after spraying multiple magazines worth of ammunition from each assailant that they opened the doors to the vehicles to confirm the status of their target. And as expected, Sultan Mehmed V lay dead in his car, his body riddled with bullets, and his facial expression conveying his shock at his swift and decisive end. Once the attackers had confirmed the death of the Sultan, they ran off as quickly as they had come, getting back in their cars and driving down the road, leaving the Sultan and his motorcade in a completely disastrous state. This event would officially spark the Balkan Wars in this timeline, and in doing so, permanently sour relations between the German Reich and the Ottoman Empire. While the Kaiser would deny any involvement in the assassination of the Ottoman Sultan, including the selling of weapons to the Balkan revolutionaries, the Ottoman Empire would still hold Germany responsible for the weapons used by the Balkan League and the extremists who sought to restore Christian rule over Constantine's city, and in doing so, no doubt would be joining the Allied powers when the Great War finally arrived. Chapter 186: Rise of the Progressive Party. There was a saying that Bruno had once heard in his past life, and the older he got the more it made sense. A society only has the amount of crime it is willing to tolerate. Why did the black market arms trade exist in this world, despite the measures that could be taken to effectively eradicate it? Because sometimes the great powers needed to supply the enemies of their enemies with weapons and munitions, only that it could be quite embarrassing to have their fingerprints on the guns. This was exactly what Bruno had done to help aid the various rebel groups in the Balkans in their aims to throw off the yoke of Ottoman oppression. Was the Kaiser aware of these activities? Not at all, nor the German High Command, for that matter. This made it all the easier to put up a convincing ode to the world who began pointing fingers at the Reich. For that matter, could the arms factory which produced these weapons, in this case von Zehntner Waffenwerk, be held responsible for the death of the Sultan? No. Once the guns left the factory, they were not liable for whatever they were used for. The fact of the matter was that it was incredibly easy for Bruno to have these weapons transferred into the hands of the Balkan League without leaving the slightest trace of his involvement. Proxies existed for a reason, hence why black market arms dealers had always been a thing. Though the Ottomans were furious that their leader had been slain with German weapons by a local resistance movement in a territory which they had occupied for centuries. Ultimately, they could not blame the Germans for the illegal trafficking of arms via the criminal underground into their territory, nor could they hold the Germans responsible for the crimes committed with said arms. Still, Turkish resentment for the Germans grew rapidly overnight. In Bruno's past life, the Ottoman Empire joined the war in 1914 for a variety of reasons. One could argue day and night over which of the grounds the Turks used as a justification for entry into the war was the chief among them. But in Bruno's honest opinion, it was a desire to regain ground lost in the preceding wars which they had fought, whether in the Balkans, North Africa, or during the Young Turk Revolution itself. Germany was an appealing ally, as a united Germany had never lost a war before. And during the previous century, the Prussian army, of which the United German Army was largely based upon, had steamrolled the French in under a year. They had done this alongside several other German states, and after marching through Paris, they declared the formation of the great empire within the French Palace of Versailles. A humiliation both France and the world had not forgotten. It was perhaps because of this that the Ottomans saw the Germans as the favorite to win any great conflict fought between the world's powers, thus chaining themselves to the German Reich like a loyal hound in the hopes that during the aftermath they would be rewarded for their submission with the scraps left behind after their master had seized what he wanted most. In other words, the Ottomans had hoped Germany would drag them across the finish line, and in doing so, grant them the territory they had lost in recent years. It was not to be in Bruno's past life. While in this life, Bruno had thoroughly ruined any chance of the Ottomans joining the imperial powers, as the Central Powers were now known as. With Russia and Austro-Hungary settling their differences in the Balkans, and instead joining together with a bond built from reforged steel, the reconciling the Ottomans into this alliance was damn near possible, as both the Habsburgs and Romanovs absolutely loathed the Turks. Through diplomacy, Bruno had effectively isolated the Ottomans, and in doing so gave them a reason not to join the war. Rather, if he simply let things be, there was a good possibility the empire would result in a quiet and dignified death. But Bruno did not desire such an outcome. For one particular reason, the fate of Constantinople would remain uncertain should this occur. Having found God in this new lease on life, Bruno saw it as his Christian duty to drag the Turks into this war so that the Hagia Sophia and Constantinople ended up back in the hands of Christendom, where it rightfully belonged. Thus, he armed the Balkan League and other resistance movements in the area, hoping they would cause enough of a stir for this to come to pass. And it worked like a charm. The new sultan was quickly crowned after the death of the previous one. Mehmed VI, who in Bruno's life was the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, had been crowned as emperor. He immediately began utilizing the Ottoman army as best as he could to invade the Balkans and put down these rebellions. A rather hasty action, one which prompted the nations of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro to effectively declare war on the Turks. There was no going back now. In the spring of 1912, the First Balkan War had erupted. Like the war in Libya, Bruno chose to sit this one out, enjoying the peace and prosperity that came from his successful endeavors, and in doing so shifting his attention to both his family and to the American election, which had begun to take a strange direction. Woodrow Wilson, having been thoroughly defamed by the many media outlets under Bruno's indirect control, had dropped out of the race prematurely in 1911 before the primary even began. As a result, the primary for the Democratic Party was held between his previous rivals, of which the man most likely to win the nomination was a candidate thoroughly committed to neutrality when it came to European affairs. Whether it was the Republican nominee who became President of the United States or the Democratic nominee, Bruno had made certain that the administration in power was not nearly as pro-war as Wilson had been, or he would have had this been a normal election. But the American national election of 1912 was a different beast from the ordinary dog and pony show, which occurred every 4 years within the country. There was a third candidate, a previous president of the United States, whose popularity was at an all-time high among those more hawkish members of America's society. With Woodrow Wilson no longer in the running, Theodore Roosevelt and his Progressive Party, not to be confused with the far-left coalition of socialists who adopted the same term during the 21st century of Bruno's past life, had now received massive funding by those very interests Bruno was secretly working behind the scenes to defeat. Unfortunately for Bruno, these wealthy men who were insistent on spreading America's democratic values across the world through military force if need be, would not go quietly into the night simply because their candidate of choice had been defeated before he even began to undergo his trial by fire. No, these men were hell-bent on their mission and would now use Theodore Teddy Roosevelt as their means to fulfill it. And they were gaining popularity quickly. Teddy Roosevelt was seen as a man among men and a man of the people. During his presidency, he had fought against big businesses to smash monopolies and institute some kind of restrictions on what could be sold to the masses in the forms of medicine and agricultural products. America, after all, had a long history of poison being sold to its people by so-called snake oil salesmen, a term that endured well into the following century as a result of the damage they had caused. The man had passed into law the creation of the FDA, which had yet to be tainted by corruption. Currently, Theodore was speaking to his backers, addressing their concerns over Germany's rapid growth and the power now concentrated in its hands. It was a concern that many American elites were having, even if a significant portion of its populations was descended from German immigrants and still held great regard for the fatherland. It was perhaps because of this that it was an issue that needed to be handled with care, and thus while Theodore Roosevelt danced around outright jumping on the anti-German bandwagon. Believe me, I am sympathetic towards your plights. Since its unification, Germany has become quite powerful, both economically and militarily. And with the recent union of the three major European empires into a single alliance, these troublesome affairs have only been compounded. The combined industrial base of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia is not in doubt unchallenged on the global stage. And if geared towards the purpose of war could see this union of imperial powers as they call themselves to emerge as a significant adversary on the global stage. But what you are all asking of me is to alienate a significant portion of the voter base. Need I remind you how much power foreign investors from the German Reich hold over the media behind the scenes? I mean, you are aware why Woodrow Wilson dropped out, right? Something sinister is happening across the Atlantic, and the Germans appear to be trying to shift public opinion in the United States towards neutrality. A significant sum of resources has been spent in this regard, and to combat it, you will all need to spend an even greater fortune. Are you all willing to pay such a high price to involve yourselves in a war which does not involve the United States, nor is in our nation's best interest? Though the men in this room did not know that a single German investor was responsible for all that had occurred within the United States over the course of the past decade, they had deduced that at least one or more major figures from the Reich was at fault. And because of this, these wealthy men, from privileged backgrounds, whose sons would not find themselves conscripted and sent across the world to some foreign earth in the name of war, were all the more willing to advocate for the poor masses to suffer such a fate on their behalf. Thus, the biggest contributor of them all was the first to step forward to voice this very sentiment. We understand your reservations, President Roosevelt, but you are now the only hope of the American people. If we allow the Germans to do as they please within our country, then it won't be long before we are bowing before them and calling them master. Need I remind you that our forefathers fought a war to escape from European control? Are we really just going to surrender now that some other empire from across the Atlantic seeks to chain us? Theodore Roosevelt knew that these wealthy businessmen despised him for the damage he had dealt to their personal fortunes over the years. He also was aware that they were trying to stoke his patriotic sentiment into spurring him so that he might do something he would otherwise avoid. And if they thought he was so easily manipulated, they had another thing coming. He smirked as he took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth he had on hand. Only after he placed his spectacles back on his head, so that his vision was proper, did the man finally respond. I'll accept your campaign contributions, but I will make this abundantly clear. Even if I do end up winning this November, I will do whatever I think is best for this nation and its people regardless of the help you have all given me in achieving this victory. Do you understand what I mean by this? The message was as clear as day. Theodore Roosevelt would take their money, but he would not get into bed with these millionaires. Not by a long shot. If they thought giving him money would grant them power over him, they were sorely mistaken. Either way, it was up to each of them to decide how they would proceed with this warning. Chapter 187. The Road to Hell Part 1. The unification of the German Reich in 1871 came with many benefits. For the first time in their history as a people, Germany was united into a single empire under a single ruler. While the Holy Roman Empire had been ruled almost exclusively by German kings throughout its history, it was composed of various cultures, languages, and ethnicities, some of which held significant power over who came to the throne. That could not be said for the German Reich. Of course, there were some drawbacks to the unification of the German states, such as the loss of sovereignty for many men who had once proudly called themselves monarchs. Among these various kingdoms, principalities, grand duchies, etc., was the Kingdom of Bavaria, which had been ruled by the illustrious von Wittelsbach family since the high medieval period. The history of Bavaria was overshadowed only by that of Prussia and Austria among the German states. But unlike the Prussians, renowned for their martial prowess, the Bavarians were well regarded for their affinity for music, theater, and the high arts. Even so, that did not mean their royal family was entirely composed of patrons of the arts or a people whose sense of regality was beyond reproach. The wife of Heidi's father was a von Wittelsbach, though her exact relation to the main line of the prestigious Bavarian royal family was uncertain. Most likely, she was a distant cousin from a branch family that was on the decline. Nevertheless, her maiden name alone commanded respect and, more importantly, authority. She was the woman who had commanded that Heidi's mother suffer an untimely death. After all, this princess was far from the archetype she bore in title only. No, she was a vicious, petty person who had always resented her husband for taking a lover and, moreover, siring a bastard girl whose beauty was well beyond that of her own daughters. The only reason Heidi was not marked for death as well was that her foolish father had actually provoked the Junker coalition by engaging his bastard daughter to the ninth son of a prominent industrial family who were little more than upstarts in the eyes of the ancient Bavarian kings and queens. Or so it was perceived by the von Wittelsbach family, who looked upon Heidi's father with disdain, despite his awareness of his own position and the unfortunate circumstances his daughter faced as a result of his actions. No one would have guessed that the man who played the part of a socially inept fool was, in fact, a wise man hiding his cleverness with a carefully crafted facade. And while it wasn't impossible for the von Wittelsbachs to lash out at Heidi during her childhood, the window for such an opportunity had long since passed. With her marriage to Bruno, and Bruno's rapid rise to prominence within the German Reich, daring to touch a hair on his beloved wife's head was as good as summoning the demon prince of wrath to unleash hell upon their family. Bruno, after all, was a man with a fierce reputation, one who had no qualms about shooting someone in the head in broad daylight, if sufficiently provoked. Thus, the current Prince Regent of Bavaria, Luitpold von Wittelsbach, was now discussing the matter with his distant relative, the wife of Heidi's father. "Woman, if you were not related to me by blood, I would have you drawn and quartered for what you are suggesting. You are talking about a man who holds the rank of General Oberst in the army and has the ear of not just the Kaiser, but the Tsar as well. In addition to this, his wealth is comparable to that of our entire dynasty, if not greater. He has private security on retainer protecting himself and his family at all times. Do you really believe it wise to provoke such a figure, when you and I both know all about his wrath? All over what? Some petty feud you have with the woman's mother, whom I already had killed on your behalf. It was one thing to kill the mistress of that idiot husband of yours, some low-born woman who nobody cared about. But that girl's daughter is a legitimate princess in Russia and the lawful wife of one of the most powerful figures within the Reich. If I hear another word of your petty plots and schemes against this woman, I will have you exiled from our family, and I will draw up papers to have you and your children fully disowned from the family line. Do you understand me?" The wife of Heidi's father was red in the face, having screamed about how much she wanted Heidi killed over the last 15 minutes, only to be so thoroughly rebuked by the current acting head of their prestigious family. After all, the current king of Bavaria, Otto I, was a man suffering from severe mental illness and was a monarch only in name. Luitpold was the real man pulling the strings, and he had had enough of entertaining this distant family member and her childish tantrums over something so common among men of power. Luitpold had damn near suffered a heart attack from the sheer amount of anger he felt at this moment. He would be turning 91 this year, and such stirrings of emotion were far from ideal for a man of his age. It was only after the troublesome member of his dynasty left him to his peace that the aging prince sat down in his seat and gazed out the window. It was still early enough in the year that snow fell from the sky into the city streets of Munich. Frankly speaking, with each passing day, Luitpold felt death's presence more and more. It would only be a matter of time before he kicked the bucket. And then what? Who would succeed him? And, more importantly, how would God judge him for all he had done in this life? Was it really too late for an old man like him, whose lifetime of sins, often done with the best of intentions in mind, were surely enough to damn him to an eternity of hellfire? The more he thought about this, as the light bulb flickered in the background, the more Luitpold felt sorry for Heidi. Her mother had done nothing wrong. She was a mistress, as was so common in this world for men of wealth and power like her father. That woman's death was on his hands. In this life, Luitpold had done only what he thought was necessary for the safety, security, prosperity, and dignity of his house. But he had to admit, what he did to Heidi's mother was without justification. If he was truly destined to hell, then so be it. But before he stepped foot in the grave, Luitpold would right at least one of the wrongs he had committed in this life. Bruno had been taking his time awaiting the arrival of the Great War, enjoying joyful moments with his wife and beloved children. His family continued to grow, especially now that his wife was nearing the age of 30. Her biological clock was ticking, so to speak, and 4 kids were simply too few. She wanted at least 6, no, 10. And because of this, Bruno and Heidi had been busy. No doubt, by the time his wife finally became infertile, they would have as many, if not more, children than his own parents had. But regardless of the increase in their bedroom activity, Bruno and Heidi constantly made whatever time was needed for their children, who were the reason they worked so hard every day. Today was a Sunday like any other. Bruno and his wife would take their children to Mass before having an outing in Berlin, enjoying a nice, respectable family breakfast at their favorite establishment. Or so it was supposed to be. Today, however, was different. As Bruno sat with his family in the restaurant of their choosing, he saw someone unusual enter. One could always tell royalty apart from the common man due to their upright demeanor and elegant way of dressing. The man who entered the diner may have been approaching Methuselah levels of age, but he was a prince nonetheless and carried himself as such. And Bruno knew exactly who he was. Because of this, he immediately stood up from his seat with a stern expression on his face, keeping his hand close to his waistband, where he could easily draw his concealed weapon if necessary. Bruno stepped between his family and Prince Regent Luitpold. Noticing Bruno's threatening posture, Luitpold took a surprising action, bowing his head respectfully before the man and apologizing for interrupting his precious time with his loved ones. "Forgive me, Lord von Zehntner. I did not mean to offend, but I figured showing up at your home would be woefully inappropriate for a man like me, who has wronged your family so. This old man only asks a moment of your wife's time. I do not seek forgiveness, for I deserve none. I wish only to express my sincerest apologies for how I have wronged her and to extend my condolences for her loss, despite the years that have passed since then." Heidi was not ignorant of who was standing before her, and if she had not resigned herself to forsaking vengeance against those who had killed her mother for the sake of her children's safety and prosperity, she would have been compelled to make a scene. Noticing their mother's distress, Heidi's children, at least those old enough to understand that she was shaken, quickly hugged her and asked why she was acting so strangely. "Mommy, are you all right? Mommy, who is that man?" Bruno wanted to tell the old man to go to hell. He knew that killing a von Wittelsbach in the middle of Berlin was a suicidal act, one that would also implicate his family. But he could not prevent himself from lashing out verbally. That is until Heidi stepped forward and grabbed hold of his hand. She was trembling with various complicated emotions, and her voice was shaking even further, but she still made it known that him acting out on her behalf would only sully his reputation. And that was the last thing in this world she wanted for the man after all the effort he had spent this past decade forging their family into one that commanded respect. "It's fine, my love. Honestly, I can spare 5 minutes. Please, look after the kids for me. I'll be back soon." Luitpold looked at Heidi as if he had underestimated her resolve, and quickly thanked her for granting him the time to properly apologize. "I understand your husband's fury, and he would be right to scorn me, even publicly. Even so, you stepped in to stop him. I must thank you." Heidi, however, sneered at the man, making him aware that his flattery was counting towards his time, and that she had only done so for Bruno's sake, and the sake of their family. "I didn't do it for you. I just don't want my husband to stoop so low for the sake of someone like you. And by the way, I said I can spare 5 minutes, and you have wasted 30 seconds of my time with this pointless flattery." Upon seeing the look of scorn in the woman's eyes, as well as the harshness of her words, Luitpold couldn't help but sigh internally as he straightened his posture, before beckoning Heidi to join him at a booth where the two of them could discuss the matter at length without worrying her family. "If you would please join me at the table I have reserved, I promise to be swift. After I have said what needs to be said, you will never hear from me or my family ever again. This I promise you." Heidi took one glance back at Bruno and her kids before returning her gaze to the Bavarian Prince Regent, where she nodded her head and followed the man to a more secluded part of the restaurant. Bruno, of course, immediately silently motioned towards the bodyguards he had embedded in the establishment to keep a close eye on the Prince Regent, as well as everyone else in the facility who could very well be members of the man's staff who he had hidden in the building in preparation for this moment. Chapter 188, The Road to Hell Part 2. It took every ounce of inner strength Heidi could muster within herself not to lash out at the man seated in front of her. She might not have known for certain that Luitpold was the one who had orchestrated the hit on her mother, but she was aware he was a von Wittelsbach and the current acting head of the ancient dynasty. He had also held this position for many years. As a result, it took only the slightest logical deduction to put two and two together. Sure, Heidi had the resources to track down who had been responsible for her mother's death, but she had long since resigned herself not to seek vengeance. Thus, while she stared at the Prince Regent of Bavaria with a hate-filled gaze so intense it could devour 1,000 star systems if it could manifest into some form of psychokinetic flame, she ultimately stayed her hand and bit her tongue, speaking only in the most curt terms as she demanded an explanation for his visit. "I'm waiting for an explanation." Prince Luitpold wore a sincere and sorrowful expression as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, which he handed over with the most respectful posture. He could manage a posture conveying his deepest apologies with a bow of his head. "My lady?" "No, Your Highness, Princess Heidi von Zehntner, I know my words will never suffice to mend the pain and sorrow I have caused you. I am a sinner in the eyes of the Lord and a foolish old man who has sullied myself and my dynasty to fulfill the request of an errant member of my house. In doing so, I deprived you of your only parent. I know I can never earn your forgiveness for how horrifically I have wronged you, especially now that I am 1 foot in the grave. And because of this, I would never be so rude as to request your mercy. Instead, I offer only my deepest apologies and sincerest condolences. I have few regrets in this life. Even with the things I have done, many of which Christ would find abhorrent, I did them for the sake of my house and the legacy of my family. But if there is one regret I have, it is what I did to you and your mother, 2 people who did not deserve the cruelty of my family. It was a flagrant abuse of my power to do what I did to you and your mother. And because of this, I can only offer this token as recompense, even though I know such a trinket means nothing in comparison to the grief you must have endured losing a parent." Heidi's eyes opened wide as Luitpold opened the velvet box to reveal the treasure inside. When it came to orders of chivalry, there were 2 types. Those intended for men, typically granted for gallant acts on the battlefield or significant contributions in fields like politics, arts, and science, and those meant solely for noble women. Few kingdoms had more than one order for noble women, as they were generally considered less important than those issued to men. However, Bavaria had 2 such orders, and one was second only to the highest order of merit or chivalry the kingdom offered. It was the Order of St. Elizabeth, a rather exclusive award used almost exclusively by the von Wittelsbach family or the wives and daughters of foreign monarchs. Heidi was so stunned by the offer that she could not respond before Luitpold ushered it into her hands. "My son's wife is the current Grand Mistress of the Order, and when I told her of my plans to compensate you in some way, she said the best way was to induct you into the order as a dame. Any fees associated with joining have obviously been waived, considering your circumstances. I'm afraid this isn't much, but it is the most I can do. I am afraid my 5 minutes are up. As promised, you will never hear from me or my family again unless we meet at some public event. Your husband is, after all, a man of supreme importance, and I get the feeling you have yet to make your proper mark on this world as well. Sooner or later, you are bound to cross paths with my family again, and I pray that by then you have found some peace in your heart over how we wronged you. Goodbye, Your Highness, and I pray for your and your family's happiness and good fortune in all that you may endeavor in this life." After saying this, the old Prince Regent stumbled out of the restaurant, where he was driven off by his staff back to his family's lands. Heidi returned to her husband and children, leaning over to whisper to Bruno what had happened. Needless to say, Bruno was surprised. It was unusual for men in positions of such privilege to feel remorse for abusing their power. Perhaps when one knew death was around the corner, they instinctively felt guilt for all the sins they had committed in life. And if that was the case, would he too feel regret toward the end of his lifespan for all the wicked deeds he had done to save the German Reich and create a better future for his family? What was the saying again? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Surely that could not be his fate. After all, why else would God reincarnate him back in time if the end of his journey was eternal damnation? Bruno ultimately forced the matter from his mind, while Heidi reflected in silence on Luitpold's final words to her. I get the feeling you have yet to make your proper mark on this world as well. Was she capable of such a thing? All she had ever wanted in life was to support her husband, the love of her life, in all he desired, and to raise his children to be men and women of dignity and respect. But perhaps she had been thinking about things the wrong way all this time. Perhaps it was not her place to silently eliminate threats in the background. After all, the award in her hand was an order of charity run by noble women. Maybe, just maybe, Heidi was meant to do far more good for the world than she had ever believed herself capable of. Her husband was a man of supreme faith, even though she herself had a hard time believing God existed in this world. Bruno had told her early in life that her suffering was God's doing and his alone. Yet, later in life, he seemed to have genuinely become a believer in the old bastard. So, what if she too had a chance to change? To let go of all the anger and hatred she silently harbored toward those who had once wronged her? What if she could transform such vile emotions into some kind of good for the world? Suddenly enlightened, Heidi's expression became rather meek and embarrassed as she tugged on Bruno's sleeve, an act she hadn't done since they were children. The man in question was too focused on conversing with his children to notice the sudden shift in his wife's behavior. He assumed it was one of his daughters or possibly his sons tugging so childishly at his sleeve, until he looked over to see it was none other than Heidi, bashfully averting her gaze, almost as if embarrassed by what she was about to say. Bruno could only raise his brow, questioning her attitude. Is something wrong, dear? Heidi felt like Bruno was about to laugh and mock her for what she was about to suggest, but she needed his support if she was truly going to let go of the past and embrace her role as a proper noble lady of virtue. Because of this, she stammered slightly as she tried to voice her innermost thoughts. Bruno hadn't seen her act so timidly since they were small children. Because of this, he knew whatever was on her mind was serious, something he could in no circumstances make light of. She was usually a confident woman, even in the face of others' mockery. But whatever Luitpold had said to her had clearly struck a nerve and caused her to question herself. So Bruno took his wife's dainty hand in a firm, supportive grip, letting her know he was there for her, both through this gesture and with his words. Heidi, whatever it is you need to say to me, just know I will always support you, no matter what it is. Bruno suspected the worst had come over her after her encounter with the man who had killed her mother. Thus, he was flabbergasted when she blurted out a selfless desire that he found completely unexpected. Bruno, I want to open a charity with a portion of our family fortune. Chapter 189, Faith and Good Works. Charity? That was most certainly not the request Bruno had thought Heidi was going to make of him. He was more or less aware of the inner demons his wife struggled with on any daily given basis. The human experience was one of great suffering, and enduring that suffering was something we all must do. Over the years, Bruno had done everything he could to help his wife overcome the challenges she faced during her childhood and early adult years. And to a great extent she had improved leaps and bounds, only really manifesting her psychotic and possessive tendencies when a threat appeared before her or her family. It was because of this he expected the woman to request that he kill the Prince Regent of Bavaria. Bruno was the type of man willing to give his life if need be for the sake of his wife and children. Hell, he would gladly take the lives of 1,000,000 men if they dared pose a threat to his loved ones. But murdering the Prince Regent of Bavaria served no purpose other than to invite disaster upon his family. And it was with this grim reality in mind that Bruno was about to reject his wife, not only to save the future of his children, but his wife's soul as well. Yet the woman completely surprised him with her request, rather than seek vengeance, which was a path that would damn them all. She sought redemption, a new start, a chance to do some genuine good in the world, and help those less fortunate than herself. It was certainly an unusual, but also a most welcome request. As Bruno immediately hugged Heidi tightly and pet her silky golden hair as if she were one of his daughters, assuring her with a slight whisper that she would all the money and support she needed to properly see through this endeavor. You damn near gave me a heart attack. I thought for a second that with the strange way you were acting that you would ask something of me that I could not fulfill. You want to start a charity? I think that is a wonderful idea. Whatever you need, whether that be money, manpower, or resources, all that you need to ask, and I will give it to you. After all, everything that I possess in this life belongs to our family. Heidi couldn't help but hold Bruno tightly. Doing so helped ease any of the remaining anger, hatred, and grief she once held deeply entrenched within her heart. After hugging her man for longer than she cared to count, she then scooped up her children and gave them an equal amount of affection, assuring them that she was all right, despite the strange way she had been behaving ever since that decrepit old man asked to speak with her. The degree of influence in which Bruno had over society was truly a frightening prospect to behold. With one word from his mouth, thousands of men and women began to move towards the beat of his drum. Money flowed, and with it came the creation of a new charity, one which was designed to help the less fortunate in German society. Food, medicine, housing, rehabilitation. If one needed help to obtain any of these things for themselves and their families, they only needed to reach out to the charity that Bruno and Heidi helped organize together. Granted, one needed to prove they weren't simply leeching off of their goodwill, and instead were actively trying to better their lives. While Bruno provided the resources to the non-profit organization, Heidi was the main brain behind its daily operations, using her spare time in between looking after her husband and children to organize the charity's efforts. Bruno had long since gained a very good reputation among the masses. He treated his employees incredibly well and provided quality goods at a fraction of the cost when compared to those sold by his competitors. He was a businessman, but that did not mean that Bruno was a man of greed. There was no reason to charge an arm and a leg for his products, something many corporations failed to understand from his previous life. One needed to find a balance between profit margins and volumes of sales, and Bruno would never sacrifice the latter for the former. Strangely enough, a man familiar with organizing relief and humanitarian efforts quickly volunteered to help in any capacity he could. And though he was an active duty officer in the German army, having in the years since his last promotion gained the rank of colonel, Heinrich Koch operated as a member of the board of directors for Heidi's new charity. He brought with him a level of expertise gained from his days in Russia, especially in regards to distribution, ensuring that the goods were constantly provided to those who needed them. Like a properly made Swiss watch, it functioned flawlessly. Because of this, the reputation of Bruno's family increased drastically, and it was not just Bruno, Heidi, and their children. Even the extended family began gaining the reputation of a charitable family, despite their wealth literally being built from the war industry. So much so that when the time once again came for the von Zehntner family to get together, Bruno was being treated as if he were the heir apparent. Even his oldest brothers Franz and Christoph, who had overlooked their youngest brother during his youth, treated the man as if he was the greatest of their siblings. Only Maximilian still treated Bruno with any form of contempt, not even bothering to go near his youngest brother, as Bruno's fame in the family had reached all new heights. Bruno and Heidi were surrounded by Bruno's brothers and their wives as they spoke flattery to the couple, as if this gathering was actually all about them. That is, until Bruno's father finally requested some private time with his son. "All right, that's enough from all of you. Franz, Christoph, I want you both to go find your little brother and keep an eye on him. I don't know why, but I get the feeling that Max is going to do something incredibly stupid if left to his own devices." Having heard their father's word, the two eldest of the 9 von Zehntner boys treated them as if they were the law, nodding to their father and bowing their heads directly to the lord of their noble house before running off to do his bidding. As for Bruno's other brothers, they scurried off with their wives as well, leaving Bruno alone with his father and his wife. Naturally, the old man showed respect to his daughter-in-law, who was the only of his 9 daughters-in-laws who he treated like the actual blood daughter. He never had. "Heidi, my dear, do I have permission to speak with your husband alone?" Bruno raised his brow at his father and stared at the man that gave off the impression he was questioning whether or not he was the in-law instead of his wife. At the same time, Heidi giggled and bowed with a proper curtsy before assuring her father-in-law that he indeed had her permission. "Of course, I'm sure my beloved husband would love to have a discussion with my father." After saying that, Heidi bowed once more before walking off with a smirk on her face, which she cast towards Bruno, causing both him and his father to chuckle. That is until his father sighed and made a comment about the woman. "She has your mother's sense of humor. Anyway, Bruno, I would like to have a word with you in private. Will your study suffice?" Bruno did not even want to talk about how similar his wife and mother were. Instead, he immediately led the way to his office, showing proper respect and manners to his father as he did so. After you, father. Chapter 190. Prophecy or Deduction. If Bruno's father wanted to speak with him in private, it must be a rather serious affair, and Bruno most certainly suspected what it was about. Thus, after the doors closed behind them, he broke out the imported Kentucky bourbon aged to perfection for 20 years. Once Bruno poured a glass to his father and himself, and they both had a sip, the old man responded with a satisfied smile on his face. You always know how to get the best stuff. Bruno chuckled, making a joke about what his father had said, one that his father wouldn't truly understand. You better enjoy it while it lasts, because in roughly 8 years this stuff is going to be damn near impossible to get my hands on, other than perhaps for medicinal purposes. Medicinal purposes? How exactly is this drinkable liquor medical-grade alcohol? Bruno's father didn't understand Bruno was referencing prohibition, which would begin within the USA in 1920, and in doing so make alcohol effectively illegal other than for medicinal purposes. But then again, Bruno had an almost prophetic sense of what would happen in the world, and because of this, his father placed down his cup on the desk before addressing the matter at hand. Funnily enough, the reason I requested this private discussion is specifically because of your uncanny ability to predict the future. As you know, I am getting old in years, and I have no intention of staying in politics for much longer. But I'm not full Bruno. Many people may not understand what you have been up to this past decade or so, and though I am ashamed to admit that it took me longer than it should have to fully comprehend it, I now know the real reason behind everything that you have done, whether it's the creation of advanced weapons, investment into a wide variety of industries, or even the reason you have decided to stay in the military and rise through its ranks all these years. You are preparing for a great war that is on the horizon, and you have been doing so alone for a very long time. So let me ask you this, my son. How many years do we have left? Bruno looked at his father with a smug smirk on his face. It was a look the old man was not expecting. That is until Bruno began to speak and explain himself. I'm impressed. You know, aside from perhaps Heidi, who knows me better than just about anybody, I don't believe that a single person in this world has caught on to what I have been doing since I first became an adult. I mean, not for nothing, but you would have to have an exceptional degree of pattern recognition to connect the dots between my various enterprises and find out what the line leads to. I must commend you. Father, I see now where I gained my enhanced intelligence from. Fine, I'll admit it. By the year 1885, I deemed it a mathematical certainty that a global war would erupt, which would devastate the German Reich within the first 2 decades of the new century. Everything I have done in my adult life has been specifically to prevent this otherwise inevitable result. Even now I race against time, knowing I have very few years left before the conflict begins to ensure that everything is perfectly in place for the start of the great war that is to come. So, the fact that you are bringing this up means you probably want to know precisely how much time we have left? Truth be told, Father, I'm not entirely sure myself. But I can tell you this, it entirely depends on how long the wars in the Balkans will last. This struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan League is just the beginning of something far more sinister. Bismarck was right in that regard. At most, we have 2, maybe 2.5 years. At least a year, maybe less. Either way, soon I will be called off to war, where I will do everything in my power to obliterate every enemy army I come across down to the last man. Well, as long as I can do so in accordance with the rules of war, that is. Bruno's father stared at his son. His expression wasn't one of shock or dismay, or even one of a grim and sobering awakening. No, he stared at his son as if he was thinking through every word the man had just said, as if he was truly trying to figure out if there was any hidden meaning concealed within them. After a rather long pause, he finally exhaled before speaking of why he had asked this question to begin with. I was planning to retire early, but if my vote can prevent the German Reich from going to war, then I might as well stay within the Bundeswehr as long as possible. Bruno, however, disagreed with his father's perspective, pouring the man another drink, and himself one while he was at it. He did not speak until they had both consumed the amber liquid in its entirety, and when he did so, he gave his father some advice. I would retire now while you can, father. Your vote will not make a difference. and if I may be so bold, if this war will start the way I think it will, your loyalties may even come into question should you refuse to cast your vote in favor or war. What is about to happen will determine whether the German Reich emerges as the supreme hegemony of this world, and in doing so, usher in a new era of scientific, cultural, and technological progress, or if Western civilization itself will collapse within the next 200 years. Either way, the war must be fought to determine the fate of our way of life. Though you need not worry, Father, so long as I am here in this world, and God remains on my side, there is no path which leads to defeat. For anyone who tries to prevent our victory will not live long enough to accomplish their aims. I can assure you of that. After saying this, Bruno placed his glass down on his desk and got up, where he patted his father on the back with a silent grin before leaving the man to his own thoughts. Either way, Bruno had said what needed to be said, and it was up to his father whether he wished to retire now, or be among those who were to blame for the suffering that would soon be forced upon the world as a whole. Chapter 191, Retirement Ceremony Part 1. In the German Reich, there were two legislative bodies within Parliament, much like in the United States, and its own legislative branch. And like the United States, these two bodies were chosen based upon two distinctive factors. Within the German Empire, the lower branch of Parliament was elected via popular vote by the citizens of the empire, while in the higher of the two branches, that being Parliament, the Bundesrat, and its members were chosen by the regional governments of every state within the empire. This was actually similar to how the United States Senate functioned originally, and even still at this time. It would only be a year from now, in 1913, where U.S. senators were elected via popular vote at the booth by citizens. A change that would never manifest in the German Reich, or at least within Bruno's past life, and hopefully never. After retiring from the military as a tried and true veteran of both the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and the later Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and having earned both classes of the Iron Cross, as well as a poor Lomérite no less, Bruno's father, who shared the same name as his youngest son, had easily climbed the ranks of German politics, first having been elected and served with distinction within the Reichstag for a number of years, before eventually being appointed by the Kingdom of Prussia to the Reichstag. It was, of course, a surprise to his fellow members of Parliament that he rather suddenly decided to retire. And in doing so, Bruno's father was being granted a massive farewell party. Of course, Bruno himself, as well as his family, were invited to attend the event, as well as all of his siblings and their families as well. One could never truly underestimate the grandeur of the parties thrown by the nobility of European kingdoms and empires. And this retirement party was no exception, having been thrown by the Kaiser himself, which was rather unusual, but when one understood it was a means of showing respect to an aging member of the Bundesrat whose service to the country could not be underestimated, one naturally understood why this was the case. Bruno, as always, was far from a social butterfly, paying pleasantries where need be, but otherwise trying his best to be a fly on the wall. Heidi was his gregarious half, who managed to convince people that her husband was far less menacing than he seemed. And while Bruno was definitely more of an introvert than he was a social butterfly, what really made him behave so antisocially at these venues was the fact that he just really hated the fakeness which the nobility in this era seemed to personify. It was one thing where back in the day the nobility had an obligation to rally troops and lead them into battle. Such was the nature of the feudal responsibilities of which many of these houses had such a prestigious and ancient lineage. But it had been centuries since feudalism ended, and without the obligation to protect and serve the people as their noble masters, the descendants of the knights and warlords of the ancient era had become a bunch of pampered and prissy wastrels. Leeches whose sole claim to fame was being the 10th grandson of some valiant warrior whose feat in battle had gained him his lands and title to be shared among his family line until the end of time. Few men gained their nobility through blood and iron these days, and those who did were generally among the lower nobility, not privy to such an extravagant gathering hosted by the Kaiser himself. Among those present, only a handful were like Bruno's family, having earned their noble status in the past century through gallant action on the battlefield, and having continued the martial tradition of military service since. Yet those were the men Bruno tended to congregate among. This was despite the fact that he was considered far more important than them. For Bruno, it was hard to listen to the pompous boasts of men who had never seen the cruelty of a battlefield, yet spoke of their ancestors' achievements as if he had slain a dragon in single combat, without staining his gilded cloak. How would you explain to a man who had been raised with a golden spoon in his mouth and silk diapers that his ancestors' chivalric legend was one of blood and guts, rather than the fantastical way in which he spoke about it? Moreover, how would a man who had not only spilled the blood of other men, but shed his own in the trenches possibly tolerate such buffoonery without having an instinctive urge to slap the ever-living shit out of the dullard who dared espouse such drivel? Hence why Bruno stood in the corner of the room, with the few other men wearing modern military uniforms, of which whose ranks were significantly lower than his, while smoking a cigarette in one hand and having a stiff drink in another. Was it intimidating to have Bruno among their ranks? Not at all. Several of these men Bruno had served with. Among them were his brothers Kurt and Ludwig, as well as several other officers who fought beneath his command in Russia and who had continued their military service after the war came to an end. In fact, their rather dark sense of humor and loud, intoxicated voices carried over, as these men caught up, reminiscing about things that made the more coddled nobleman's skin crawl. One of the men spoke of Bruno as if he were the Grim Reaper. Yet he did so in a way that sounded as if they were old friends reconnecting in the afterlife. All the while he spoke of the time Bruno walked through the trenches outside Tsaritsyn, clubbing communists over the head with his sharpened entrenching tool. I swear to God, I'm not lying. You had not yet arrived in the Volga theater yet. This man literally just walked through the trenches with a spade in one hand and a pistol in the other, smacking guys over the head with his entrenching tool, and they just dropped over dead as if they had been touched by death himself. I was about to get stabbed by some Bolshevik piece of shit's bayonet when the next thing I see is the cold and murderous gaze of our brave commander as he raised his shovel in the air above the stupid commie's head. Poor son of a bitch didn't even know that death was right behind him, boring a hole through the back of his head with the most hate-filled gaze I have ever seen in my life. Bruno had a particularly grim and stoic reputation among the German nobility, and this officer's loud boasts did not help in that regard. Bruno, however, shocked those who did not know him personally as he broke out into a chuckle and shook his head, with an almost nostalgic smile on his face as he did so. I remember that. Fucking idiot genuinely thought he was going to take the life of one of my officers right in front of me. Well, he sure learned his lesson, didn't he? A rather permanent one, I might say, if I were so bold. The only one among the group of veterans from the volunteer force once known as the Iron Division who was not laughing was Kurt, who was the leader of the combat medics within the unit. He shook his head and blew out a plume of smoke as he called his brothers and comrades sick in the head for laughing about such a traumatic event. You fuckers are disturbed, you know that? I still have nightmares about the poor sons of bitches I had to stitch up in that assault. Luckily, we killed all the Marxist swine responsible for all that death, or else I would never be able to sleep at night. Bruno couldn't help but pat his older brother on the back and make light of the whole situation as he pointed out the medals on all of their chests, some of which were German in origin, a medal created specifically for the Iron Division's actions in the war, and others were granted to them by the Tsar, who awarded thousands of Bruno's volunteer soldiers with distinctive honors for the roles they each played in saving the House of Romanov and the Russian Empire as a whole. Hey, it was all worth it at the end of the day, right? I mean, a soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon, right? All the men knew that Bruno was quoting Napoleon when he said those last words, and rather facetiously so. The men laughed at Bruno's comments, as they were all too aware of the price that had been paid by them all for the sake of a piece of steel and a slightly dyed piece of cloth. That is, until they saw who stood behind Bruno, and they all instantly shut their mouths and bowed their heads. Bruno immediately knew by the way his comrades were acting that he had put his foot in his mouth right in front of someone important, and if he had to guess, it was none other than the Kaiser himself. Chapter 192, Retirement Ceremony Part 2. Bruno had realized damn near instantly that he had said something incredibly improper at the worst possible timing. Judging by the reactions on the faces of the veterans, he was just bantering with via dark humor just a moment prior. Someone of supreme importance was standing behind him and had heard every word he said. The voice, of course, was instantly recognizable to Bruno, and he himself flinched before turning around when he heard the smug tone in the Kaiser's voice when he responded to Bruno's rather ill-suited attempt at a joke. I must say, is this how a son shows his love and respect for his father? And no less on the day he is to be awarded for a lifetime of effort and achievement with a medal for all of his services to my royal house of Hohenzollern. Kaiser Wilhelm II was standing next to both Bruno's father and the current chancellor of the German Reich, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. While in the background, Bruno saw Heidi face-palming at him while shaking her head, along with all the not-so-silent whispers and worried looks he was being given by the rest of the guests in the venue. Bruno had realized only then that their voices had carried Thorighout the venue, and that their gruesome tales of the battlefield had made more than a few important figures in the German Reich deeply uncomfortable. There was really only one thing he could do at this moment, and that was to apologize for his incongruous remarks, which he was just about to do so when Bruno noticed the shiny new metal pin to his father's rather elaborate tailcoat tuxedo. It was the non-combatant version of the House Order of Hohenzollern. A rather prestigious order indeed, one which Bruno hoped to earn himself one day. Honestly, Bruno had done more than enough for the House of Hohenzollern to earn such an award, and yet he had yet to have such an honor pinned to his chest. If Bruno was being honest with himself, he expected the Kaiser was waiting for him to gain significant achievements in the upcoming Great War in order to properly award him, as all of his major efforts to help the German Reich up until this point had been via diplomacy and efforts behind the scenes in the civilian sector, which, while significant accomplishments on their own, were not as suited for public relations purposes as it would be if he were awarded with the combatant variants of the same medals after achieving significant victories over the Kaiser's enemies within a major war. Because of this, Bruno simply bowed his head and apologized to his father and the Kaiser for making such a poorly timed, inappropriate joke. "Apologies, Your Majesty. It was very rude of me to make light of such things, especially on a day to honor my father such as this. Do forgive me." Kaiser Wilhelm II simply chuckled as he saw how Bruno was behaving in front of him. The man's usually stern and defiant demeanor was nowhere to be found, and because of that he made fun of Bruno at his expense, while also reassuring the man that after all these years he really should not behave so formally with him. "Nonsense. I was just having fun at your expense, my old friend. Besides, if anyone has earned the right to make light of such circumstances, it would be you. After all, you are the one who championed such a campaign in the first place." The Kaiser's jovial attitude towards Bruno was not just because he genuinely sought a friendship with the man. It was every bit as strategic as it was sincere. After all, letting people know he was on close terms with the legendary Wolf of Prussia, so much so that they could share such informal humor openly, was a way of tying Bruno to his side and dissuading those who would try to steal the relatively young general's talents for themselves. Because of this, Bruno could only respond in kind, taking advantage of the situation to act in a way he otherwise would never be able to get away with. "Well, old friend, I am glad I was able to play the fool in a way that could lighten the mood." Kaiser Wilhelm used this opportunity to lean close to Bruno and whisper something in his ears that Bruno found relatively shocking. "I don't know exactly what you said or did to my daughter, but she has been in a rather foul mood whenever your name comes up ever since your last visit to Japan. Whatever is going on between the two of you, I would suggest you take the time to clear the air, because you do not want me personally investigating the matter, understood?" Bruno was shocked to hear this. He had not spoken with the Prussian princess in a while, or frankly speaking any of the other princesses of the noble houses he currently held some degree of diplomatic influence with. Hell, it had been at least a year since he last took a trip to the land of the rising sun, or perhaps it was closer to 3 whole years now. Just how long had the Prussian princess been angry with him, and about what per se could she possibly hold a grudge against him for? Also, the threat was subtle but noticeable at the end of the Kaiser's statement, and because of this, Bruno nodded his head and responded with a short and concise response in the affirmative. "I understand. I'm not sure what I did to aggrieve your daughter, but I will handle it. If you will excuse me, sir, I will go settle this matter once and for all." The Kaiser simply designed Bruno's response with a slight nod of his head before returning his attention to the rest of his guests. All the while Bruno ran off to go find the young Prussian princess who, though he had not realized it, had tarnished his reputation among the younger generation of German noble maidens with outlandish and slanderous tales of his flagrant mistreatment of women everywhere. Chapter 193, Godspeed, Soldier. Bruno quickly absconded from the spotlight and instead began searching for the Prussian princess who by now was a full-fledged adult. Time had of course passed far quicker than Bruno could have ever realistically imagined when he was first reincarnated into this world. The first time he had ever given the young woman any thought during this new lease on life was when Bruno was a mere 15 years old. He stood up for his then fiancée's honor at the princess's second birthday in 1894. 18 years had come and gone since then, and in September of the current year of 1912 the young lady would turn 20. It was only a year before she would marry the man she was supposed to be with in life, which was Ernest August, a man who was currently the heir to the Duchy of Brunswick. And yet Bruno had heard no mention of her engagement to the man. Needless to say, it was not surprising when he found the young woman surrounded by various other German ladies of high noble heritage. These young women, who were the same age or younger than the Prussian princess, gave Bruno complicated expressions, that is, until they ignored them entirely and spoke to the woman he had come to see. "Your Highness, your father said that you have some sort of grievance with me. Is that true? If so, can I know what I have done to offend you?" The various noble ladies broke out into fits of giggles, being well accustomed to hearing the young Prussian princess express her grievances with the man she had formed a crush on much earlier in her life. However, she was quick to give them the evil eye, before dismissing them from her presence entirely with an authoritative tone and aura Bruno was not expecting to witness. "Leave us." The various young noble ladies curtsied before the princess and Bruno alike before fleeing while laughing and whispering among themselves all sorts of gossip. Once they were gone, Princess Victoria Louise gave Bruno a stern gaze before speaking to him in an almost commanding tone. "Take a walk with me. And no, I won't accept your refusal. I want you to listen to my story as this. This may very well be my last chance to speak my mind." Bruno took one look back at the glimmering lights in the background as the young princess motioned towards a staircase which led out of the palace and into the palace gardens below, which, though covered in snow, were no less beautiful beneath the wide and starry moonlit sky above. Because of this, Bruno nodded his head and agreed to follow the princess into the great outdoors, even if she was not dressed for the part. As the two trudged through the snow, after exiting the venue of the party, Victoria Louise Dam near slipped on the snow and ice which coated the walkway, causing Bruno to grasp hold of her arm and steady her against him, all while scolding her as if she were some clumsy child. "Be careful. Your father would have my head if anything happened to you on my watch." Though Bruno couldn't see it as the princess cast her face away from his gaze, there was a bitter smile on her face, as if she were compelling herself to enjoy what she knew would be the last conversation she had with the man alone together. After consciously coming to this conclusion, she stopped dead in her tracks, even as Bruno walked beyond her reach, causing the man to turn around and look at the severe expression on the princess's regal face. He was about to say something, even if he wasn't sure what, when she commanded him to stop before giving him a piece of her mind. "Not a word. Not until I have said everything that needs to be said." Bruno, having finally come to the conclusion that he must have somehow, some way serious hurt the young woman, bit down on his tongue, even though he wanted to defend his ignorance. Instead of nodding, as it was clear to him this was a royal decree, one which he could not disobey. It took the princess several moments to gather her thoughts, and in the end she broke out into a bitter laugh, while shaking her head, sighing heavily, almost as if she wanted every gasp of breath to exude from her lungs before she finally shared her thoughts. And finally, she opened with an insult to the man. "You have to be the single dumbest, yet brilliant man I have ever met in my life. Did you know that? Were you even the slightest bit aware of how we all felt throughout all these years? I mean, it was abundantly clear to your wife. But I don't think you ever really figured it out, did you?" Victoria Louise was correct. Bruno had never once had a single inclination that he had left an impression on the various princesses he had come into contact with over the years, one that in their young and impressionable minds made him the object of their affections. Because of this, Bruno was quick to confirm he had no idea what the Prussian princess was talking about. Even if he could surmise when she used terms like we and us, she was referring to Olga, Sakura, and Hedwig. I'm sorry. What precisely are you referring to? After realizing it was true that Bruno was not pretending, he genuinely never once considered the various princesses as a possible romantic interest, and rightfully so considering the age gap between them. She shook her head once more, before kicking the snow beneath her feet in an act of immature indignation. If only I had been born a decade earlier. Maybe then. Maybe it would have been me and not Heidi. But fine. Since you can't seem to figure it out, I will say it outright. You were my first crush. And it's not just me. Olga, Sakura, and Hedwig all feel the same way. And like the stupid little girls that we were, we all clung onto the idea that maybe, just maybe one day you would see us as women. But you never did. We were always just children to you. Even now I can see the look on your face, as if you can't comprehend it. Whatever. It's too late now. By this time next year, I will be married to a man far beneath you in terms of quality. Perhaps at one point he would have been able to boast that his lineage was greater than yours, but you are a prince now, even if it is a prince in Russia, and he is a mere duke. My father worries too much. I have already accepted my fate, my place in this world. He thinks I will foolishly reject the betrothal he has arranged for me because of some childish fancy I once held for you. But I am glad he had enough foresight to have you seek me out so I could vent to you about all of my frustrations. I suppose it was simply never meant to be. Princess Victoria Louise had not even allowed Bruno to respond. She picked up the bottom of her dress and began to walk back to the venue. All the while snow began to fall from the sky once more. The dark clouds of winter had during her rant covered the moonlight above and replaced it with darkness. The only source of illumination were the lamp posts stationed in the garden, of which Bruno stood nearby as he pulled out his pack of cigarettes and began to smoke in silence. He could tell by the trail being indented in the snow that the princess had begun to cry, and because of this he made one last remark to her before walking off himself. You know, I didn't lie to you. That one time in the garden when we shared tea together. I really am my man from the future, or at least I have the memories of such a life. It was never my destiny to become a prince of legend and marry into the royal family. That is not the cross in which I must bear. I am no monarch, no philosopher king who will usher in a new era of prosperity for the German people. I am a soldier whose singular purpose in this life is to ensure that the Reich survives the turbulent era which is to come. Don't feel too bad. There was simply never a chance for us to be together. God made sure of that from the moment he brought me into this life. And if it makes you feel any better, you are the only person I have ever told this. Even Heidi doesn't know the truth. After saying this, Bruno walked off, not saying another word to the princess. He was, after all, bewildered by the sudden confession and had nothing to say other than he never felt that way about her. At most, she was like a niece to him, one which he felt an obligation to protect. As for Victoria Louise, she broke out into a fit of giggles while wiping the last tears she would ever shed over this matter from her eyes. She didn't know which of the two of them was more insane, the madman preaching false prophecy or the princess crazy enough to believe him. All she could do was turn around and gaze upon Bruno's backside as he walked away in the snow, making a comment about what he had said in a whisper so low the man could not possibly hear her. Godspeed, soldier. Chapter 194. Selecting a replacement. Bruno returned to the party not long after his conversation with the Prussian princess. They would never speak again of what had been said in private within the snow-filled palace gardens, nor would there be any hostilities between them due to the awkwardness that had resulted from the misunderstandings of a teenage girl and her unrequited love. In fact, Hedwig, Olga, and Sakura were all around the same age and would themselves be married off in the following years, forgetting all about whatever foolish notions they had towards Bruno. This did not mean, however, that the bonds Bruno had forged with their royal families as a result of these misunderstandings would disintegrate. Rather, he would be far friendlier with all of them going forward, as any sense of unease caused by these misunderstandings was thoroughly gone, replaced instead with a sibling-like friendship. When Princess Victoria Louise returned to the party in a much better mood than she had been for quite some time, the Kaiser approached Bruno and patted him on the shoulder. I take it things went well between the two of you. This was a question obviously hinting at Bruno to address the elephant in the room, whether he had cleared up the matter between him and the Kaiser's daughter. Bruno simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a flask, whose leather carrier was embossed with the symbol of the German Eighth Army, which he had recently been given command of. The flask naturally contained some form of distilled spirits, and from the slight sense of intoxication the Kaiser received just by taking a whiff of it, he figured the alcohol inside was unusually potent. After taking a swig from the flask, Bruno quickly stashed it away before grumbling something or other about what he had just been through. Had I known she had such feelings toward me, I would have told her to get over them a damn decade ago, before they had time to manifest into something stronger. Why the hell didn't you tell me about this? Kaiser Wilhelm II displayed an unusually chipper and playful character toward Bruno as he smacked the man on the back, joking at his misfortune. I'm more surprised you never figured it out. I honestly thought for a very long time you were simply leading my daughter on in the hopes you could have her as your mistress when she finally came of age. But then that day came, and you were still as oblivious as ever. Imagine the surprise of my wife and me when we realized you were actually socially inept and that it wasn't all some Machiavellian scheme, which we had suspected was the case for years on end. I suppose if you're not even tempted by a beautiful and young princess who is wholly devoted to you, then your wife really does worry too much after all. Her gaze is unusually fearsome whenever it's cast in the direction of my daughter, an expression I hear isn't unique to Victoria alone. Bruno couldn't help but gawk at the shamelessness of the Kaiser, a man he had immense respect for. His expression caused the monarch to laugh at his expense, prompting an even more unusual reaction from Bruno. You're actually enjoying this, aren't you? Wilhelm looked away from Bruno with a guilty expression on his face, which he tried to hide rather poorly, at that by drinking from the cocktail in his hand. Unfortunately, he utterly failed to do so, choking on the drink through his own laughter at the absurdly offended expression Bruno was giving him, as if he genuinely couldn't believe his eyes at the German emperor's sheer audacity to enjoy his personal lament. Finally, Wilhelm admitted to it with a rather amused tone in his whimsical voice. Honestly, I am very much so. It's nice to see that you're more human than I thought. Frankly speaking, even I was a bit concerned you might be a legitimate demon hiding within the flesh of a man. I mean, your ruthlessness in pursuit of the enemy is legendary, and even you have to admit you have a rather sick sense of humor. Yet somehow you are charismatic enough to, without even attempting to do so, charm four imperial princesses to the point where they fruitlessly pined after you for years, only for it to turn out that you were completely oblivious to their affection the entire time. It's a rather humorous chain of events, no? For the first time in Bruno's life, he was left entirely speechless. Usually, he had something to say in response to any statement casting shade at him, but he honestly could not think of a single thing to retort with in this circumstance. And thus, he chose the honorable option, silently admitting defeat and coping with this loss by drinking. He immediately reached back into his coat pocket and pulled out his flask, taking another swig from the exceptionally powerful spirits inside. Afterward, he waited for Wilhelm to respond, which he eventually did. It's good to see that she can finally move on. I suppose this is ultimately the best outcome for everyone. Well, Bruno, I must say this has been a hell of a retirement ceremony for your father, although I will admit I will miss his expertise sorely. But I suppose that nobody would dare complain if your father was succeeded by your brother Ludwig, right? Sure, his tenure in the Reichstag has been short, but even I must admit he is a natural when it comes to politics. Bruno nodded in agreement with the Kaiser's suggestion. With the combined influence of the House of Hohenzollern and the German Conservative Party, of which Ludwig was elected as a part, getting him appointed to the Bundesrat by the Prussian state government was a relatively simple matter. Bruno knew it was best for both him and his family for Ludwig to be in such a position when the war broke out. Politically speaking, having a member of the von Zehntner family within the Bundesrat and on the Land, Army, and Fortresses Committee gave Bruno and his family significant influence within the empire. At the same time, Bruno knew Ludwig would oppose the Great War with his vote when the time came, giving their family a reputation as those who opposed unnecessary wars while still being willing to fight for the fatherland when the need arose. After all, Bruno would hold significant authority over the war effort when the conflict finally arrived and could theoretically have complete operational control over an entire theater of war at its start, thus giving credence to their family's reputation as war industrialists. It always served their interests to openly oppose war, even if they profited from it, while also fighting in said wars to prove they weren't cowards. Thus, Bruno had been quick to not only endorse his brother during his run for office, but also agree with the Kaiser's suggestion. I can't help but concur. Ludwig will be an excellent replacement for our father. As you said, he has incredible latent potential, even if he is a bit inexperienced in the world of politics compared to other potential candidates for the position. You have my full support, albeit however limited my influence may be over the party. Kaiser Wilhelm II looked at Bruno with a questioning gaze, almost as if he were trying to determine if Bruno was genuinely dense again or if he was simply trying to act humble. The truth was that it was the former. Bruno had a tendency to overlook his influence on society as a whole. The fact of the matter is, even if all he did was verbally endorse his brother with a public message, that alone could be enough to sway many members in the German Conservative Party and the Kingdom of Prussia's state government towards supporting Ludwig's appointment to the Bundesrat. Perhaps it was because Bruno had an incredibly humble outlook on life, or maybe it was because he was heavily introverted at heart. But his tendency to overlook his public perception in the eyes of others was one of the reasons he had never once thought that Victoria Louise, Olga, Hedwig, or Sakura had any interest in him. When the Kaiser realized this, he couldn't help but chuckle once more before assuring Bruno that it would be best if he gave a public endorsement to his brother. Regardless of what you may think, I would advise you to come out publicly with the idea that your brother Ludwig should replace your father on the Bundesrat and give a list of reasons why, especially before he officially puts himself in a position to do so. You may be surprised by the effect your word has on the whole ordeal. Wilhelm didn't wait for another word from Bruno in response. Instead, he smirked smugly as he walked off, drinking from his cocktail once more. Bruno, not thinking anything of it, decided he would do exactly as the Kaiser advised, entirely missing the point the man tried to make him realize as he did so. Chapter 195. A grim reminder of the cost of war. Bruno came out a fortnight after his father's retirement on a public radio broadcast, speaking about his father's achievements, both on the battlefield and within the field of politics, throughout his lifelong career of service to the German Reich and the Kingdom of Prussia. The radio broadcast went on for some time, and it was only thanks to the substantial investment in both German infrastructure, as well as scientific talent, that such things were able to occur across the country so early in the 20th century. But eventually, the subject came to the recent retirement of Bruno's father, as well as the award he had been granted personally by the Kaiser for his decades of service to the German Reich. However, there was a third question mixed in, one which Bruno suspected was arranged by the Kaiser for Bruno to advocate for Ludwig to fulfill the role, a man who had yet to be even considered a candidate for the newly vacant position. Bruno was quiet at first as he took a drink from a glass of water that was provided to him by an aide for the sake of the interview. It was clear to those listening that he was thinking through his exact words, and evidently, he had put some thought into them as he went on a long-winded speech about his thoughts on the subject that conveyed some deeply personal opinions and excessive emotions toward one particular subject that nobody expected. First of all, I would like to say that it is the foremost honor that a son could ever ask for in this life to be the progeny of a war hero like my father. For those who are not aware, my father is a man who spent the better half of his life serving the interests of the House of Hohenzollern and, by extension, the German people through selfless sacrifice via military service. My father is a highly decorated senior officer and a veteran who fought on the front lines of 3 wars that had been waged over the course of the previous century for the purpose of unifying our people into the great empire that we are today. And I would also like to mention that this honor extends to my grandfather as well, who had the esteemed fortune of fighting alongside His Highness King Frederick William III and his royal army at Waterloo, where we earned our nobility by sending that French bastard Napoleon into exile, where he belongs. Now, I mention this because it is entirely relevant to the point I am about to make. So please bear with me as I continue with my thoughts. After his retirement from the German army, my father went on to have an exceptional career as a politician, both in the Reichstag and the Bundesrat. As you all should be aware, the Bundesrat is where my father spent the final days of his political career until his retirement a mere 2 weeks prior to this day. And it is because of my father's exceptional military career and the battles he has waged on behalf of our great Reich that he is a man who understands all too well the price that men like my brother and I, his sons, have paid in times of war. With my father now retired, there is a vacant seat on the Bundesrat, one that several candidates have come forward expressing their interests to fulfill. It is a seat that represents the Kingdom of Prussia and everyone in it. Now, I can't speak for these men. I am sure they are attracted to such a position of power purely out of interests of serving the German people as my father was, rather than out of any nefarious motives. But what I do know about these men is that not a single one of the candidates presented has ever once served in His Majesty's armed forces, let alone stepped foot on a battlefield and witnessed what happens there. And it is because these men do not understand the price that must be paid, should the time come that, God forbid, we need to declare an offensive war, that I cannot in good faith trust them to cast a vote in favor of such a horrific conflict, while fully being aware of the brutal and gruesome price men like me will have to pay for their ignorance. No, I do not agree with any of these men who have stepped forward to fulfill my father's esteemed shoes. Rather, as controversial as this may seem, as I know there will be those among you who think what I am about to say is an act of nepotism, I assure you that I only have myself in mind, along with the brave young men currently serving beneath my command in the 8th Army, as well as any other lad who currently and proudly wears the uniform of His Majesty's Armed Forces, or even those who may find themselves serving yet, when I say that it is my personal belief that there is nobody better suited to replace my father than my elder brother Ludwig. And before any of you interrupt me, I will outline my reasons for saying this publicly forthwith. Like my father, my brother has spent years commanding men in battle. Sure, he was a volunteer in a war that many of you say was not one we should have been involved with. But the men serving beneath him were your brothers, your sons, and your fathers. We chose to take up arms in some foreign land, waving the banners of our forefathers, to fight against an enemy that we believed would one day march through the very streets we call home and bring hell with them. And believe me when I say, my brother was there for the worst of it. From the moment we arrived in the besieged city of St. Petersburg, we slugged through rivers of mud and blood as we cleaned out Ingria and Volga together side by side. Now it is no secret my brother left the conflict earlier than I did. He had seen enough to understand what price must be paid, and nobody could ask any more of a man who volunteered for a conflict beyond our borders. I mention all of this because it is my genuine belief that there is only one type of man who should ever be permitted to cast a vote toward declaring an offensive war. The man must have personally commanded troops in the field and have borne witness to the price that is always paid by other men when you send them off to fight a war you have started. A price that is paid not only by the brave soldiers who wave the colors of the fatherland as they charge into gunfire and into certain death, but also the toll that is exacted on the people who are left behind to bury their remains once they are gone. Only such a man should ever be given a position of power over the life and death of the citizens he represents, and my brother is such a man. As expressed earlier, I am afraid that this arbitrary qualification that I have to endorse any candidate seeking such a powerful position over the life and death of our people cannot be found among any of the candidates who have been proposed to replace my father, both within the Bundesrat as a representative of the Kingdom of Prussia, but also on the Committee of the Land, Army, and Fortresses. I confess that I pray to God every day that such a grim reality never befalls this world. But should the day come where I am called to war, along with your fathers, your brothers, and your sons, then we better have a man like my brother Ludwig making the decision whether or not our blood, our lives, and our souls are worth the price of such a war. And with my life in the hands of a man like Ludwig, then I can go do God's work, knowing that the right choice has been made, and without question do what is required of me. For if my brother is not even considered among the candidates, and instead a man like those already presented has been chosen to succeed my father, then how could he possibly know whether or not a war waged beyond our borders is worth the price that will inevitably be paid for his mistakes? There was a long pause following Bruno's statement, which he had prepared in advance for this meeting. But the way in which he spoke made it sound as if he had come up with it on the spot. It was very naturally stated, and because of this, even the producers who were already prepared in advance with the speech were awestruck. It would take a moment or two before the radio broadcast got back in full swing, but Bruno's words had far greater effect than he would ever have thought, especially among the Reich's active duty soldiers and many veterans, as well as their families. Bruno made it clear, though he may be a general, that did not mean he had ever once disregarded the lives of the soldiers beneath his command. In fact, by the way he spoke about the subject, the price that was paid for any war that he had ever, or would ever, wage was already far too great. The blood of the men who followed him into battle was worth far more than could ever be justified to spill for the sake of a few petty disputes between politicians who were all too unwilling to sacrifice themselves and their sons for the conflicts they had started. Bruno's image, especially among those who had personally witnessed the horrors of war, immediately skyrocketed, and so too did Ludwig, as Bruno's praise immediately secured the goodwill of the people necessary to see him appointed to the Bundesrat as their father's successor. Chapter 196, Germany's Guardian Angel. Though Bruno had made a great speech about his brother Ludwig being a suitable candidate for the Bundesrat, it was ultimately of little consequence in the grand scheme of things. Frankly put, whether or not Ludwig made a grandstand to vote against the war and protested it as vehemently as possible, it did not matter. War would be waged, blood would be shed, and millions of young men would die for no reason. Bruno's only hope was that he could spare as much suffering as possible for his fellow countrymen, with whom he would agonize in the upcoming conflict. And as another year came and went, the Great War became a closer and closer to reality. It did not take long, just as in Bruno's past life, for the Ottoman Empire to admit defeat in the Balkans. They had been thoroughly trounced, and even quicker than Bruno had anticipated, as a result of him indirectly selling arms to the Balkan League. Just like in Bruno's past life, a second war erupted almost immediately after, as Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria all began to argue over various disputed territories in the region. The war was, as far as Bruno considered, inconsequential in and of itself. Rather, what the Black Hand would do shortly after its end was a matter he needed to keep an eye on. And Bruno had been quite satisfied with how he had spent the last decade of his life. Over the course of the last 10 years, Bruno had made ample preparations for the upcoming war effort. Whether it came in the form of modernizing and streamlining German field artillery into 4 different calibers 75 mm, 105 mm, 150 mm, or 210 mm, as well as the adoption of a codification of mortars similarly organized into the following calibers: 60 mm, 81 mm, and 120 mm. Bruno had ensured through these developments that German artillery was sufficiently capable of both defending their own borders as well as raining hell down upon enemy fortifications. In addition, he had adopted a series of flak guns that were more than capable of lasting until the 1950s as efficient means of shooting planes out of the sky. He had also helped establish the lines of communication between these units and the greater battalions, brigades, divisions, corps, and armies they were combined with. German communications were protected via a series of advanced encryptions made entirely possible by the introduction of the Enigma machine several decades earlier than it otherwise should have been. All of these things paled compared to what he believed would be the single largest killer on the modern battlefield. The widespread adoption of machine guns and barbed wire were pretty much confirmed to be the 2 most efficient killers of the war in Bruno's past life. Bruno often wondered in his past life how the man who invented barbed wire for the purpose of containing cattle would react had he known that his creation would one day be used as one of the single most devastating instruments of war, a device that helped contribute to the deaths of millions of young men. But those deaths would only be compounded in scale as Bruno had introduced a far more effective machine gun, one that, if need be, could be entirely operated by a single man. The biggest problem facing machine gun crews during the Great War was that their weapons were entirely static. It required significant effort to move them. An entire team of men had to disassemble the weapon and carry it to the next position. It simply was not feasible as a mobile weapon and could not reasonably be used in an assault. Because of this, light machine guns were invented to fulfill this role of assault, but these were far from ideal, especially in this era, with the 3 most prominent of them being the failure-prone Chauchat used by the French army, the bulky Lewis gun used by the British soldiers, and, lastly, the abomination known as the MG August 15th. This so-called light machine gun, was simply a Maxim machine gun with a stock crudely welded to the back, a pistol grip added to it, and a bipod hanging off the water-cooled jacket. Only God really knew how the German soldiers managed to carry this 40 pounds monstrosity into an assault over the trenches. One can only assume that the cocaine which was regularly issued in their field medical kits was the deciding factor in this regard, and surprisingly, this behemoth of a weapon, which for reasons beyond imagination was technically classified as a light machine gun, was actually the most effective of such weapons manufactured during the era. Why was this the case? Because, unlike its rivals on the battlefield, this weapon was actually belt-fed, much like the heavy machine gun it was based upon. Meaning, even with its ungodly weight, it was still able to fire at a practical rate several times that of its competition in the trenches. All of which utilized limited box magazines that needed to be exchanged after every 20-30 rounds fired. The invention of the MG-34 several decades earlier than it should have been was a game-changer on the battlefield. So much so that with the introduction of this weapon alone, the Schlieffen Plan, which Bruno had rejected, became viable. Why was this the case? Because the MG-34 had over double the rate of fire as the MG-08/15, while being roughly half its weight. With such overwhelming firepower deployed at the squad level, there was no reality where Germany would not annihilate the Allied troops at the First Battle of the Marne, where, in Bruno's past life, Germany had been defeated, resulting in the 4-year horror that was the Western Front. It was a short march into Paris from there. So why had Bruno rejected such a plan? It was his honest belief that a quick victory like that of 1871 would only further French revanchist sentiment, as the Franco-Prussian War had done. The French army needed to bleed massively and endure the horrors of sending wave after wave of their men to their deaths at the German border, only to be repelled each time. Every man, from the lowest enlisted personnel to the highest generals, needed to understand that fighting the German Reich was an act of futility, that they would always be inferior, and because of this, attempting a third war in less than a century was folly. It was his hope that he could eradicate an entire generation of Frenchmen, and in doing so, drown any revanchist sentiment among the failed republic in a sea of their youth's blood. Only then would the stubbornness and arrogance of the French be thoroughly humbled. Hence why, despite the extreme viability of the Schlieffen Plan resulting in a near immediate victory within this life, Bruno had openly rejected it and used his influence to force Germany into a defensive war on the Western Front, while he mobilized the Eighth Army to knock out the Balkan states, followed by the Italians as quickly as possible. All of Bruno's plans had finally come together, but today he was surprised to find that something unimaginable had occurred, and one that was not his doing in the slightest. Over the last year, Heidi had been operating her charity with the full financial support of Bruno's multiple monopolies. Bruno, while initially taking an active role in helping organize the charity, eventually withdrew from the process altogether once things were properly up and running. And it was because of this that Bruno was dumbstruck when Heidi knocked on his office door with a stack of papers in her hands. His wife was once more pregnant, and noticeably so, but even then, she did not take a break from her charitable work. No, she was serious about helping the people of Germany, and not just Germany. Her work extended into Austria-Hungary, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg as well. However, when Bruno gazed upon the papers his wife handed him, he was well and truly shocked. He was quick to check the numbers repeatedly before asking the question on his mind. Are these figures accurate? The tone in his voice was one of absolute severity, as if, should his wife lie to him about what he was witnessing, he would be very angry with her, but she simply smirked smugly before leaning over the desk and grabbing hold of her husband's tie, where she dragged him in close to her before whispering her answer. Of course they are. I always told you I would do my best to help you. You have been rambling on about the great war that is to come for some time, and until now, I could never help you or ease your constant worries. But what about now, my love? Did I do good? Was I finally able to help alleviate at least in part the massive burden you constantly carry on your shoulders? Bruno forced himself away from his wife's controlling grip, instead placing the folder down, which contained the information that had so stunned him, all the while he himself grasped her wrists, pulling her into his arms as he hugged her tightly and kissed her on the lips, before responding to her question with an answer she had been longing for. Heidi, my love, you may have just saved the lives of 1 million young men. Words cannot express how thankful I am for all that you have done for me this past year." What Bruno said was revealed by the folder and the contents that lay openly on display, as he had not shut it when he placed it down upon his desk. Heidi had been hard at work using her charity and Bruno's connections to recruit over 100,000 trained nurses and doctors for the sake of the upcoming war. She had also been stockpiling medicine in near unquantifiable figures, as well as any other medical supplies that were necessary. Among these massive reserves was a newly invented medicine that Bruno's largest pharmaceutical company had only recently finalized the development of, one that had been in the process of creation since 1903. Penicillin, the life-changing antibiotic, was on the list of most sought-after medical treatments on the litany of resources which Heidi had purchased in bulk, meaning that not only would the German army have the support staff of reserve nurses and doctors for the unprecedented figures of wounded soldiers who would be treated, something they were severely lacking in Bruno's past life, but the antibiotic which had saved more lives than just about any other medicine was ready to be used, thus increasing the likelihood of a man's survival upon being treated. Heidi's actions would go on to single-handedly save the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of young men who would be wounded in action during the Great War, and it was something that Bruno had completely overlooked in his preparations. Bruno would go on to call his wife an angel who God had sent to the earth as a means of saving the German Reich in ways which he had rather ashamedly failed to prepare for on his own. A quote that would forever lie next to her name in the annals of human history. Chapter 197, Deploying to Sarajevo. As 1913 entered the middle of its year, Bruno found himself deployed away from home for the first time in a very long time. Since the end of the Russian Civil War, he had more or less operated primarily out of the Central Division of German High Command, meaning he was no more than an hour's commute back and forth from his home. For the better part of a year now, Bruno had been given command over the 8th German Army, a unit of some renown, especially during their newest commander's past life, where they had been responsible for the victories at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. The conclusion of these battles had more or less cemented a German victory in the East, even if it took the Russian Empire another 2 years to fully capitulate. In this life, however, Russia was an ally of the German Empire, and thus Bruno was not sent to East Prussia to guard against a potential Russian invasion. Instead, he was sent into the Balkans, specifically to the borders with the Kingdom of Serbia. The German 8th Army combined with the Austro-Hungarian 5th Army, as well as the Russian 1st and 2nd Armies, combining into a force of roughly 1 million men in total. These armies were equipped with the latest weaponry employed by the 3 European nations within the United Imperial Powers and had deployed to the easternmost territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as security concerns in the region became increasingly present. To put it simply, the Second Balkan War had already begun and was nearing its end. The Kingdom of Bulgaria was losing badly, and in their efforts to claim Thrace for themselves, Bulgaria had managed to effectively antagonize all of its neighbors into declaring war on them. Whether it was Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, or even Romania, which, as a result of Bruno's grim warning, had tried its best to stay neutral until now, Bulgaria found itself beset on all sides by a coalition of enemies who under any other circumstances would be just as likely to fight among themselves as they currently were with Bulgaria. Even if Bruno had some form of inexplicable desire to aid Bulgaria in its defense, doing so now served no practical purpose as the war, which was meant to last no more than 2 months, was already nearing its completion. Because of this, Bruno had been dispatched to the southeasternmost portion of Austro-Hungary with 300,000 men in tow under the guise of joint security operations within regions of Habsburg rule that were showing revolutionary sentiment. As for the roughly 500,000 Russians, they were set upon their own borders, which neighbored the belligerent nations of the Balkans, under a similar fade. The very act, while seemingly hostile to the world, had some validity in the eyes of the public, as recent attacks by partisans, ethnic militias, and religious extremists against other such communities warranted some kind of gendarmerie response. Although many foreign political and military analysts concluded that the overwhelming number of troops sent into the Balkans by the three European nations of the United Imperial Powers was a pretext for far more sinister plans, such as an outright and total invasion of the independent nations within the region. And while Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Franz Joseph I, and Tsar Nicholas II assured the world that this was most certainly not the case, instead insisting that they had simply sent such a large force not only for the sake of peacekeeping operations within their own borders, but also as a deterrent to the ongoing participants of the Second Balkan War, as a means to prevent them from unlawfully invading the borders of the three empires. Few who understood the complex nature of the region bought such a line. Because of this, the citizens who lived in the Balkans were rather on edge. Bruno currently sat within a small cafe operated and owned by a local family within the city of Sarajevo. The family was ethnically Serbian, as Bruno could tell by the distinctive cross pendant worn by the waitress, who rather anxiously tended to him. She poured some fresh coffee into Bruno's cup as he enjoyed a local delicacy, all while gazing at his rather distinctive uniform with only a limited understanding of what it represented. Bruno expected the sheepish lass of questionable age would not dare speak to him. That is, until she finally gave voice, after standing frozen in spot in front of the foreign military official for some time. I never thought I would see the day when German soldiers marched through the streets of Sarajevo. You're an officer, right? Bruno looked up at the young woman, who could not possibly be older than 18, and placed his fork and knife down, an act that caused the girl to flinch, until he put on a gentle smile and took a friendly tone in response to her question. A general, actually. You're speaking with the man in charge of the 3,000 German soldiers who are currently marching through your streets. What is your name, if you don't mind me asking? The young woman was too shocked by the admission that the man sitting in front of her was in charge of the German troops deployed to the region under the guise of security operations, and was quick to drop her mouth, forgetting her manners entirely as she blurted out her thoughts, rather than answer Bruno's attempt at friendly conversation. You're a general? But you're so young. The girl had mistaken Bruno's age as that of a man who had yet to reach his mid-20s. He, after all, had rather exceptional genes when it came to the process of aging, or at least the appearance of it. This caused Bruno to chuckle and shake his head as he corrected the young waitress's misunderstanding. Though I am most certainly the youngest man to hold my position, I assure you that I am older than you think. I turned 34 in December. So rather than question me on my rank, how about you come out and ask the question that is really bothering you? The young woman looked around, almost as if she were searching to see if anybody was listening in on their conversation who shouldn't be. After confirming that no such thing could be detected, she sighed heavily in relief before transitioning back to a nervous expression, near trembling, as she voiced her concerns. It's true, isn't it? The war that is being fought in the area. It's about to turn into something much greater, isn't it? I mean, that is why you are all here, right? Bruno could tell that the waitress was incredibly worried about the future. And why wouldn't she be? The lives of not only herself and her family, but everything she held dear were clearly hanging in the balance. It was one moment away from being completely annihilated by the flames of war. And because of this, Bruno did not lie to her. He was quick to speak the truth, albeit in a gentle manner, hoping to ease some of the poor young woman's overwhelming anxiety. Yes, that's right. At the request of His Majesty Franz Joseph, the German Reich has dispatched its 8th Army to the border of Bosnia and Serbia. Not only are we here to quickly dispatch these unlawful brigands who have taken advantage of the chaos east of these lands to cause some unnecessary trouble, but we are also here to ensure that if war does break out within the coming months, it does not make its way here to the peaceful city of Sarajevo. However, you needn't worry to the extent that you are currently suffering from. I assure you, there is a reason that despite my age, I am the youngest General Oberst in the long and prestigious history of Germany and its many constituent states. I promise you this. I will burn Belgrade to the ground before I ever allow the armies of the Balkan League to step a single foot within the city limits of Sarajevo. You have my word. Bruno did not say another word after this brief but intimidating statement. He didn't need to. Such a promise was worth more than its weight in gold. And with him acting as Bosnia's defender against the Serbian army and any invasion they might have planned for the region, There was a higher chance that God himself would descend from the heavens with the sole purpose of ending this conflict before it truly began than there was a possibility that Serbia would emerge victorious in the opening exchanges of the Great War. Thus, despite the bold, grim, and intimidating words that Bruno had just spoken to the timid young maiden, she felt nothing but calmness and relief following his departure. She was shocked to find a rather excessive tip, in addition to payment for the meal he had just eaten. A tip that was accompanied by words of wisdom she would urge her family to follow. Though I am confident in my ability to repel any invasion the Serbian army might attempt into these lands, modern artillery has significant range and is entirely unpredictable. Use this gift to get yourself and your loved ones far away from this city and the upcoming war. Chapter 198, Regicide Part 1. Bruno's deployment to the Bosnian city of Sarajevo was, in all honesty, short-lived. The war between Bulgaria and its neighbors was simply not destined to last long. Within another month, it was over, and the powers of the world incorrectly assumed that the threat of a great war had been completely averted. But Bruno knew better. Even so, when he returned home, he was not in a jovial mood, nor did he lie to Heidi and tell her that everything would eventually be all right. He merely told her the truth. Peace would last only a bit longer before the world burned itself in global conflict. Heidi, of course, knew this was true. She was intelligent enough to see what the world was quickly becoming and also trusted her husband beyond measure. If he said a major war was coming, then that was unquestionable. Because of this, she did not worry. Not truly everything that could possibly be prepared for had long since been done so by her man. All she could do was pray to God that he would keep her husband safe and sound throughout the years of turmoil that would soon be upon them. Hence, Bruno opted to spend the remainder of his time no longer worrying about what was to happen. After all, everything had gone according to plan, including the 1912 U.S. presidential election, where, by nobody's surprise, the America First coalition banded their resources together to prevent Theodore Roosevelt from winning a third term. Instead, William Howard Taft was elected president, and because of just who was financing him behind the scenes, the new U.S. president and his administration would do everything in their power to stay out of the war altogether. Assuming, of course, that Germany or its allies did not do something monumentally stupid like provoke the American public into a state of outrage, as they had done in both world wars during Bruno's past life. Sitting in a room within a building that belonged to the Serbian government was a group of men. These men came from all walks of life. Some of them were senior officers in the Royal Serbian Army. Others were officials within the ranks of Serbian intelligence. Among them were even a few prominent statesmen, including a member of the Serbian royal family. This prince stood among the ranks of his fellow conspirators and was quick to speak on what they had just discussed. So, it is agreed then. We will supply and train these little brats to deal with the problem for us. In doing so, we can avoid total accountability for what is about to happen. There was utter silence within the room, and while nobody voiced disagreement with the treasonous plot that would embroil the world in a war that stretched across the globe, they all nodded their heads in approval. And thus, the Serbian prince was quick to confirm the plan in motion. As of this moment, there was no stopping the Great War from beginning, nor was there a way to prevent the timeline from restoring its natural order. Very well then. We are fully committed to supporting Young Bosnia. Young Bosnia was the name of a revolutionary organization to which the man who would eventually be held responsible for plunging the world into total chaos belonged. In Bruno's past life, they had committed the act after being armed and supplied by the Black Hand. It was the reason Serbia rejected Austro-Hungary's request for an unbiased international investigation into the death of the heir to their throne, and in doing so, caused the outbreak of the Great War. Despite Heidi's best efforts to eliminate the Black Hand, they were a tenacious, cockroach-like organization. The problem with dealing with revolutionary groups like the Black Hand was that just because you took out their leader didn't mean you ended their reign of terror. No, so long as their ideals were around to be preached, and there were men ignorant or vile enough to commit violence on their behalf, such groups could survive even the end of times. Hence why Bruno had been certain, even after discovering the untimely death of their leader, that the Black Hand would survive long enough to start the Great War. With the current leaders of the Black Hand in agreement, and the unconditional support of the Serbian crown behind them, the time to act was now. They would spend the next year or so training young Bosnia and its members to commit this heinous act of regicide. Bruno noticed in the papers that Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were on their way to Sarajevo, where he had just been deployed. He and his men had been withdrawn from the region after only a month of deployment because the three emperors of Europe believed the threat had passed, but Bruno knew better. Tomorrow, Franz Ferdinand would die, and a month later, war would spread across Europe. The time had come, and because of this, he finally decided to tell his wife the truth, or at least the partial truth. He approached Heidi, who was busy reading a story to their younger children, who, in recent years, had been born, despite more than half a decade between their births and those of his older children. Heidi had begun to change in subtle ways over the past year or two since she had finally let go of the past burdens. She had always very much loved Bruno and the children they had together, but Bruno had always known that something deep down inside the woman he loved had kept her deeply paranoid about her family being taken from her. It was one of the reasons she had always acted with such hostility toward any potential threat that reared its ugly head. But now she was at peace, and the graceful smile on her gorgeous face, even now as she entered her early 30s, was like that of an angel sent by God. Bruno was a man of extreme fortitude. In this life and his past life, he was a veteran of more than 5 wars combined. There were few things on this mortal earth that could compel him to feel a sense of anxiety. Yet, at this moment, as he knew what awaited him, as he understood what he was about to tell his wife and the dangers it posed, he felt an intense knot in his stomach. Even so, he needed to say what was plaguing his mind. Should he die in the war, and Heidi never learned the truth, he felt that lying to her all these years would condemn him to an eternity of hellfire. And thus, Bruno signaled his presence with a slight knock on the door, as well as a soothing whisper of his voice. All the while, Heidi's gentle and nurturing tone continued to resound throughout the room. "Heidi, dear, may I request a moment of your time?" It was not unusual for Bruno to ask for a private moment between him and his wife. They were a married couple, and such a thing was needed for intimate bonding. Because of this, Heidi tried to reject Bruno's request as politely as she could, fully misunderstanding his intentions. As she did so, "Can it wait? I'm with the children right now." Bruno chuckled and shook his head immediately after understanding what his wife had assumed before quickly correcting her thoughts. "Believe me, dear, what I have in mind is far more important than what you are thinking. Could you spare a moment of your time to meet with me in my office?" Whatever it was that Bruno had in mind, it was far more serious than the woman initially thought, and because of this, she was quick to agree to her husband's request. "Give me 5 minutes to make sure the kids are properly prepared for bed, and then I will join you right after." Not another word needed to be said, as Bruno politely nodded his head before wandering off to his office, where, as promised, Heidi met him at the door not a moment later than the time frame she had given him. Heidi, however, surprised Bruno as she hugged him tightly and kissed him immediately after the doors had shut behind her. The passion with which she displayed her love for her husband was almost as if she were trying to inhale every last gasp of breath from Bruno into her lungs. After breaking away from the man, she held her head tightly against his chest, almost like a wounded kitten, before voicing her greatest fears aloud. "It's happening, isn't it? Your previous deployment to Sarajevo was just a fluke, but this time, you really will be going to war again." It had been many years since Bruno last marched away from home to go fight in some foreign land, and, frankly speaking, Heidi had gotten accustomed to having her man at home with her, safe and sound. Bruno sat his wife down in front of his desk as he poured himself and her a stiff drink. Heidi seldom consumed alcohol and had never once touched a cigarette in her life. Such things were indecent for a woman to partake in. The mere fact that Bruno was even offering her a drink spoke to the severity of what he was about to tell her, and because of this, she happily accepted the hard liquor for the first time in her life. Making a novice's mistake, she drank down the high-proof scotch in one solid gulp before near coughing up a lung. Naturally, Bruno immediately ran to her side and messaged her back, laughing as he commented on her foolishness. "I forgot you had no experience with distilled spirits. Please let me apologize not just for offering you such a potent drink, but also for what I am about to confess to you." Hear my story, my love, and listen well, because I fear this might very well be my last chance to tell you the truth of who I am and all that I have been through. Chapter 199, Heartfelt Confessions. It was clear that Heidi's sudden ingestion of the distilled spirits had caused some degree of intoxication right off the bat. Her face flushed red, and the light in her eyes dulled slightly. As a woman who seldom ever touched alcohol, it was rather easy for her to get drunk. Once she had enough of the drink to calm her nerves, Bruno did not pour her another. Instead, he drank from his own glass before he admitted the truth he had concealed from her over the course of their lifetimes. I will be frank with you, Heidi. What I'm about to tell you is an unbelievable story, one which I do not have the means to prove in the slightest. And should it merely be a fanciful story concocted from a mentally ill mind, I would not blame you for changing your perspective about me. However, the reality of the situation is that the war I am about to wage against our enemies is one that will be far grander in scale, and in the destruction it will wreak upon the world than just about anything in recorded human history. Though I am a general who will largely be sitting in the rear echelons, commanding men to go kill and die in my stead, there is a very real possibility that I will not make it back to you alive, or as the same man I am today. With all of this in mind, I wanted to confess my greatest secret to you, my beloved wife, and the mother of the children, so that I can go defend you and the fatherland from its inevitable destruction. Heidi wasn't stupid. She knew Bruno better than anyone. She had grown up with the man since they were small children. She had always known that he was hiding something from her, something that explained his damn, near-prophetic understanding of the world and its future, as well as the unusual intelligence and wisdom he had possessed since she met him. She had on a few occasions over the years tried to pry into this mysterious background, only for her efforts to result in total futility. Because of this, she sat there silently, with a serious expression on her otherwise intoxicated face as she allowed the man to continue with his story. I'm ready. Whatever you need to say, I will hear it. Go ahead, dear. Bruno took a deep breath before confessing all that he had wanted to say over the course of the last 30 or so years of them being together. How from the moment he was born, he had possessed the memories and thoughts from a man who had lived another life. A life set in the future, one which he had abhorred. He spoke in great detail of how the world had progressed following the defeat of the German Reich in 1918, and how it was something virtually unrecognizable when compared to the civilization he now found himself living in. Crime, corruption, decadence, and despair. Man was meant for so much more than this. It was not a suitable way to live, and yet it was the world he had lived through, one which constantly marched forward under the guise of progress, when in reality they were only hastening their own demise. In a world where nobility, virtue, and general human decency seemed to have completely evaporated from the hearts of man, Bruno found himself living among the depths of depravity. Was it possible to be a decent man in indecent times? Bruno was the answer, as he too had fallen prey to the liberation of his own base desires. Only after he had grown old and alone did he realize such an existence was nothing but degrading and insulting, one which had an incredible corrupting effect on the souls who partook of their newfound freedom. Ironic that he lived for nearly 6 decades in that world, watching it get worse with each passing year, only to find his happiness with his death and resurrection in a time better suited for a man of conscience and character like he was always meant to be. Needless to say, the story was far longer than either Bruno or Heidi had expected it to be. Heidi sat listening in silence, clearly mulling over every word that her husband had spoken, as if within her own mind comparing them to all that she had known in this life. Her response was unusually calm and measured as she stepped forward and grabbed Bruno's chin in her 2 dainty hands. The tone of her voice was neither shrill nor hostile like Bruno had expected it to be. Rather, it was filled with nothing but love and warmth. This is going to sound strange, but I believe you. I don't know why exactly I do, but I know you better than just about anyone. There were no lies when you spoke to me just now, and if I'm being honest, this would explain a lot of mysteries that surround you. If what you say is true, and this is the way the world will become, and what will become of the future of our children and our children's children, then all I have to say is this. Whatever you do when you go to fight for family and fatherland, there must be no hesitation in the way in which you act, nor can there be any mercy shown to our enemies. You must unleash a hell so ferocious upon our foes that they would think twice before ever attempting to create a world filled with such madness and depravity. Whether once more in this life or in the lives of our descendants 10 generations down the line, do not allow your better nature to prevent you from doing what needs to be done." After saying this, Heidi dragged Bruno's face forward to her own and kissed his lips gently. Bruno had been shocked by her reaction. He had honestly expected her to behave hysterically towards his admission. Yet she believed every word he had said, and he could see in her eyes that she was telling the truth when she said that. It was at this time Heidi made a joke to kill the tension in the air that was so taut one might be able to accidentally decapitate themselves with it. "So, does that mean I have to call you Karl from now on? Because I'm not going to lie, I really hate that name." Nothing more needed to be said between the two of them. The potential rift that Bruno expected to be created between him and his wife over this massive revelation was a fear he had only now realized was a figment of his own imagination. However, Heidi shocked the man with a revelation of her own about the role she had in connection with German intelligence and how she had used this as a means to help him and their family in ways that she found to have dirtied her hands. It was another lengthy conversation, one that would result in healing for both of them. The two major secrets this couple kept from one another came out into the open, and the fears of rejection they had regarding these things were proven to be nothing but falsehoods, tricks of their own minds. In the coming days, which would lead to the outbreak of war, Bruno would spend them at home with his family. A giant weight had been lifted from both his shoulders and that of his wife's. The two of them no longer had any insecurities about their relationship and its potential for failure hidden deep within their hearts. Because of this, Bruno and Heidi's relationship seemed to vastly improve during this time. But unfortunately for Bruno, peaceful eras were short, and he was a man of war. And it just so happened that such a gruesome and brutal reality was not far behind. Chapter 200, Regicide Part 2. Before Bruno realized it, the time had arrived. Today was the 28th of June, 1914, a day that would instantly be recognizable to an educated individual, one that would forever live on in infamy, both in this life and, of course, Bruno's past life. Gavrilo Princip was a name that a student of history should also instantly recognize. Not even 20 years old on this day, he was thus considered a minor within the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its boundaries. He, along with 5 other students, had over the course of the last year or so been plotting the assassination of the Habsburg dynasty's heir apparent. They had been trained, armed, and given the resources necessary to conduct this attack by hidden elements of the Serbian government. In the previous timeline, the man in charge of the group known as the Black Hand was the leader of Serbian intelligence, but Heidi had already dispatched the man to hell in years prior. No doubt, this was because of Bruno's actions in this new timeline, which had splintered off from the original as a result of the butterfly effect. Even so, the Sisters of Fate were hard at work mending the rift between the two timelines, and as a result, an unlikely figure stepped forward to fulfill the role Apis had played in supporting these would-be assassins, whose common goal was the liberation and unification of a Yugoslav state. To put it simply, a member of the Serbian royal family had seized the initiative to strike back at the Habsburgs, whom he wrongly believed were responsible for the death of Apis and several other key Serbian government and military assets throughout the years. However, things were not going according to how young Bosnia and the Black Hand had initially planned. The original intention was to bomb the Archduke's motorcade, but due to a series of mishaps, the perpetrators had utterly failed to do so. Worse yet, this had alerted the authorities to what they were trying to do. A less determined man would have called off any further attacks, choosing instead to regroup and reorganize for another attempt. But fate demanded Franz Ferdinand's death. Because of this, Gavrilo Princip immediately planned to intercept the car carrying the Austrian Archduke as he tried desperately to return to the safety of his lodgings. Just as in the previous timeline, the driver of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car took a wrong turn that directly led to precisely where Gavrilo Princip was standing at the moment they hit the brakes and came to a stop. At first, the young student gazed in awe, almost as if the heavens were supporting him from behind the scenes. He then fumbled into his pocket, pulling out the FN Model 1910 semi-automatic pistol chambered in .380 ACP that the Black Hand had given him to accomplish the sinister deed. He already knew the gun was loaded and immediately fired off 2 shots at the motorcade. The first struck the Austrian Archduke in the jugular vein, a death sentence in nearly any era, as one had a limited window of opportunity to be successfully treated for such a fatal wound. And while Gavrilo Princip had tried his best to shoot the current governor of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a man by the name of Oskar Potiorek, he utterly failed to hit his mark, instead fatally shooting Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, who was Franz Ferdinand's wife. In his final moments, a man would reveal who he truly was if given the opportunity to do so. Despite knowing that his death was near, the Archduke of Austria made not the slightest attempt to call for aid for himself. Rather, his sole concern in that moment was for the well-being of his wife and the mother of his children, as he shouted out his final words, pleading with her to live on for the sake of their offspring. Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children. Gavrilo Princip, realizing he did not have time to get off another shot and hit the man he had tried to kill, pointed his handgun at his own head and was about to pull the trigger. But fate had other plans in store for the assassin who had just committed the most heinous sin in human history, an act of murder that would compel millions of men to kill each other over the course of the next 4 years. And with its conclusion, the death of Western civilization. No, Gavrilo Princip was prevented from taking his own life after he cowardly ambushed and shot the heir apparent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as his innocent wife. He was immediately seized by the authorities, or at least those who were not desperately trying to stave off death's attempts to reap the souls of their monarchs. But unfortunately, both the Archduke and his wife would be pronounced dead not long after, orphaning their 3 children and causing an international incident so severe it would kick off one of the deadliest wars in human history. The next day, Bruno read about the deaths of the Archduke of Austria and his wife. He didn't even finish his breakfast, nor his coffee. Instead, he placed the newspaper down on the table and walked off with a rather ominous statement, one that only Heidi would understand among those who were present to witness it. And so it begins. Heidi did not make a move to stop Bruno. Instead, she looked down at the paper he had been reading moments before and saw the headlines. It had finally come, what Bruno had been warning her about for years, what his entire life's goal revolved around. Within a month's time, Bruno would be shipped off to lead men into battle in the Great War. Heidi could not help but wipe a tear from her eye, hoping her young children did not witness it, as she silently thought to herself a litany of prayers to protect her husband and ensure that he emerged victorious. Not only for his own sake or that of their family, but for all of Germany, because she was all too aware, after Bruno's confession, of how the world would end up should the German Reich lose this war.